The town of Dust Hollow sat in a valley between two ridge lines that blocked the wind just enough to make the summers unbearable. It wasn't a pretty place, and nobody who lived there pretended otherwise. The main street was packed dirt that turned to mud in the rains and cracked to hardpan in the dry months. The storefronts leaned slightly toward each other like old men gossiping. The church at the far end of the street had a bell tower with no bell. Someone had meant to install one for years, and the empty frame had become a kind of local joke that stopped being funny a long time ago. But Clara Whitmore's bakery, Whitmore's Goods, painted in careful letters above the door, was different from everything else on that street. It smelled like something good. It smelled like cinnamon rolls fresh out of the oven at 5 in the morning, like the sour tang of bread dough rising in the back room, like molasses cookies cooling on the rack near the window. People said you could smell Clara's place from 2 streets over on a still morning, and they weren't wrong. Clara was 23 years old, and she had been running the bakery alone since she was 19, the year her mother died, and her father, Harlan Whitmore, decided that grief gave him the right to stop working. She had learned to bake from her mother, learned the way you learn something from someone you love, not from a book, not from careful instruction, but from standing beside her in the warmth of a kitchen and watching her hands and eventually knowing what to do without being told. She was good at it, not just competent, not just reliable. She was genuinely gifted, and the town knew it. People rode in from the outlying homesteads to buy her bread. The saloon owner, a tight-fisted man named Briggs, who once haggled a widow down on firewood, paid Clara's full asking price every week without a word of complaint, because her pies were what kept people sitting at his tables on Sunday afternoons. None of that mattered on the morning Harlan Whitmore walked into the bakery before she'd opened the shutters, sat down on a flour sack, and told her he'd arranged a meeting. With who? Clara asked. She was scoring the tops of loaves, not looking up. The Aldridge family. She set down the scoring knife. What for? Harlan had the particular manner of a man who knew he was about to say something his listener wouldn't like and had already decided he didn't care. He was a lean man, her father, with sun-weathered skin and eyes that looked at everything with a faint air of disappointment, including her. Preston Aldridge is looking for a wife, he said. His family's got the biggest cattle operation between here and the county seat. They want someone local, someone settled. Clara looked at him for a long moment. He's never said 2 words to me. That's the point of a meeting. Papa, you're 23 years old, Clara. He said it like an accusation. You think you're going to keep working this oven until you're 40? You think that's a life? I like my life, she said quietly. You like being alone. She turned back to the bread. When is this meeting? Saturday, 11 o'clock, at their house. She didn't answer. Harlan took her silence as agreement, which was something he'd done her whole life, and stood up and left, letting the door bang shut behind him. Come. The Aldridge house was the largest private residence in Dust Hollow and the surrounding area, a 2-story structure built from milled lumber that had been hauled in at significant expense just to make the point that the Aldridges could afford to haul it. It had a covered porch that wrapped around 3 sides and glass windows in every room, which in this part of the country was the kind of thing people noticed and talked about. Clara had been past it 100 times, but had never been inside. She wore her best dress, pale blue cotton with small buttons down the front, pressed carefully the night before, and her good boots, and she'd done her hair up in the way she'd seen illustrated in a magazine someone had left in the bakery 6 months ago. She'd practiced the style twice before she got it right. She tried to feel confident about all of this, and mostly failed. Harlan walked beside her but didn't talk to her, which was ordinary. He'd put on his good shirt, the dark one with no visible mending. He'd slicked his hair back with something that smelled like machine oil. The housekeeper let them in and showed them to the parlor, which was furnished with more care than anything Clara had seen outside of a catalog. Dark wood chairs with cushioned seats, a low table set with a tea service, lace curtains, actual lace, not the machine-made kind. On the wall, a framed painting of cattle in a green field. More of an advertisement than art, Clara thought, and then felt unkind for thinking it. The Aldridges were already waiting. Margaret Aldridge sat very straight in a wingback chair with the posture of a woman who had spent decades insisting on posture. She was perhaps 55, with silver-streaked hair and a face that might have been warm once but had spent too long at altitude. Beside her stood Preston Aldridge. Clara had seen Preston around town, though they'd never spoken. He was 30, maybe 31, with the well-fed look of a man who had never missed a meal or doubted his right to the first helping. He was handsome in a blunt, uncomplicated way. Square jaw, broad shoulders, light hair, and he stood with his arms crossed and looked at Clara the way you look at something you're considering buying and haven't decided about yet. Margaret Aldridge spoke first. "Miss Whitmore, what a pleasure. Please, sit." They sat. Tea was poured. Harlan smiled his best company smile and said something about the weather that Clara didn't track because she was watching Preston, who was still watching her, and his expression had not changed. The conversation moved around her. Margaret asked about the bakery, asked it with the particular politeness of someone who didn't really care about the answer, but understood that questions were the currency of these situations. Harlan answered more than Clara did, talking up the business, the regulars, the reputation. Clara nodded in the right places. Then Preston spoke. He'd been so quiet up to that point that when his voice came, it surprised her. "Turn to the side," he said. Clara thought she'd misheard. "Pardon?" "To the side." He gestured vaguely. "I want to see you from the side." The room went very still. Clara looked at her father. Harlan's expression didn't change. He gave a small nod, the kind that meant do what he says. There was a long moment where Clara sat very still and understood, in some wordless but complete way, exactly what was happening and exactly what it meant about how she was being thought of. Then she turned slightly in her chair because she didn't know what else to do. Preston studied her. He made no effort to be subtle about it. His eyes moved over her with the detached assessment of a man looking at a horse he was thinking about buying, and Clara could feel every inch of that gaze and wanted to disappear through the floor of this expensive parlor and out the other side. "She's heavy," Preston said. He said it to his mother, not to Clara, as if Clara were not present. "Preston," Margaret said mildly, the mildness of someone who agreed but had better manners. "I'm just saying what's true." He finally looked at Clara directly, which was somehow worse than being ignored. "I'm not trying to be cruel about it, but I have a reputation to think about. People look at who a man marries." Clara sat with her hands in her lap and said nothing. Her face felt very hot. Harlan cleared his throat. "Clara is strong and capable, healthy. She works hard. You can see that from the business." "I'm sure she works hard." Preston sounded bored. "I'm not questioning her character. I'm saying she'd need to lose weight before I'd consider moving forward. That's my condition." He looked at Clara again. "About 30 pounds, I'd say. Maybe 40. The number landed like something physical. Clara heard it and felt it and couldn't quite believe it. "We can revisit this in a few months," Margaret said, smooth as oil on still water. "If Miss Whitmore is willing to make some changes, I think there's a very promising situation here for everyone. The Whitmore name is well regarded locally, and the bakery is certainly—" "I think we understand each other," Preston said. He'd already lost interest. He was looking at the window. Walking home, Harlan didn't say much for the first block. Then he said, "It's not an unreasonable request." "He didn't request anything," Clara said. "He told me what was wrong with me." "That's not—" He said it like I wasn't there. He told his mother, not me. "Clara." Harlan's voice had the tight quality it got when he thought she was being difficult. "The Aldridges are the most connected family in this county. If you marry Preston, you never have to worry about money again. I never have to worry about money again. The bakery could expand. You'd have a real house." "I have a real house. You have a room above a bakery." He stopped walking. She stopped too, a step ahead of him, and turned. "You're 23 years old," he said. "You're not getting younger, and he's right that you've put on some weight. I've noticed it myself." Clara looked at her father for a moment. She thought about all the things she could say. She thought about the fact that she had kept the bakery running for 4 years, that she'd paid their bills and mended their roof and done it all while he sat in the evenings with his whiskey and his grievances. "Fine," she said. "I'll try." She didn't know then what trying was going to cost her. But it started the way most things do, reasonably. Clara cut back on portions, ate less bread, which was like asking a blacksmith to handle less iron. She walked more, taking the long way to the market in the mornings, going out in the evenings after the bakery closed, moving through the quiet streets when no one was watching. The weight did not come off quickly because bodies are stubborn things that do not rearrange themselves on anyone's schedule. She lost a few pounds in the first month and felt hopeful, and then the scale seemed to stop cooperating. She started skipping dinner, then she started skipping lunch. She was rising at 4 in the morning to bake. She was working until 7 in the evening. She was running a business on a body that was slowly being denied the fuel to run it, and the results were what you'd expect. She was exhausted all the time. She had headaches that came and went without warning, and somewhere in the second month she started crying at small things. A dropped jar, a customer's offhanded remark. The way the light looked in the late afternoon, coming through the bakery window and hitting the flour dust hanging in the air, which was beautiful, which reminded her of the mornings when her mother was alive and they would bake together, and neither of them thought much about how they looked. Mrs. Pullman, who ran the dress shop 2 doors down, told her about a tonic. "My cousin swore by it," Mrs. Pullman said, and pressed a small bottle into Clara's hand with the urgency of someone conveying something important. The tonic tasted like vinegar and something bitter underneath, and Clara drank it twice a day because the bottle said to, and it made her feel slightly sick in a way that was different from the hunger sick. So she supposed they were at least doing different things to her. The town knew. That was the worst part of small places. You couldn't change privately. The moment word spread that Clara Whitmore was being considered by the Aldridge family, the whole of Dust Hollow had an opinion about it, and most of those opinions involved what Clara needed to do differently. She heard things in the bakery, not directed at her mostly. People spoke about her in the third person, even when she was standing 2 feet away, which seemed to be a thing people did when they were discussing a woman's body. "She's looking better, don't you think?" And then, "Still has a ways to go." And then, "Well, Preston Aldridge has standards. Can you blame him?" There was a woman named Dora Hicks who had been quietly unkind to Clara for years, in the particular way of women who have decided they are your friend but want you to do slightly worse than them. Dora started dropping by the bakery on a regular basis, ostensibly to buy bread, actually to look at Clara with a measuring eye and say things like, "You're looking thinner, I think," with the emphasis on, "I think doing a great deal of work." Clara smiled and thanked her and wrapped her bread and made change. And at night she lay in her room above the bakery and stared at the ceiling and tried to remember what it felt like to be at ease in her own body. The memory kept slipping when she reached for it. Her menstrual cycle stopped in the 3rd month. She told herself it was stress. She probably told herself other things too, but she was getting good at not listening to what her body was telling her. Harlan checked in on her progress with uncomfortable regularity. He had taken to asking after her weight in the same tone he might use to ask about the weather, conversationally, without a great deal of investment in the answer, but consistently, as if it were simply an item on his list of things to monitor. "Did you weigh yourself this week?" he asked one evening, sitting at the kitchen table while Clara cleaned up the bakery after closing. "Yes." "And?" "I'm down another 2 pounds." He did some arithmetic in his head. 18 total, he said. "That's not bad. You've got another 12 to go by the Aldridge count." "I'm aware of the count, Papa. I'm just saying the wedding can't be set until—" "I know." She wrung out the cloth and hung it on the edge of the sink. "Can we not talk about this tonight? I'm tired." "You're always tired lately." "Yes." She turned to look at him. "I am." He looked away first, which was something. The scale moved in the 4th month. Something changed in her body, or broke, she wasn't sure which, and the weight began dropping faster than it had before. It didn't feel like an achievement. It felt like something being taken from her against her will, except she was the one taking it. She was cold all the time. The bakery was the only warm room in her life, and she stayed near the ovens more than she needed to. She was thin enough now that people were making different comments. "Doesn't she look wonderful?" And then sometimes, when they thought she was out of earshot, "Maybe a little too thin now? She's looking peaked," as if there were a correct amount, a precise dial setting, and women's bodies existed to be dialed to it by whoever happened to be in the room. She caught her reflection in the bakery window one morning and didn't immediately recognize herself, which was a thing she had heard people say but hadn't expected to actually experience. She looked at the woman in the glass for a moment, the angle of the jaw, the definition of the collarbones, the eyes that sat slightly deeper in the face than they used to, and thought, with a strange detachment, there she is, the acceptable one, the one that might be allowed. She didn't feel proud. She felt like she'd been erased and replaced with an outline. It was Mrs. Delaney, who ran the boarding house at the end of the street, who first said it out loud. Clara had come in to deliver bread, a weekly order, 2 loaves of white and 1 of rye. And Mrs. Delaney had looked at her for a moment, really looked, in the way of someone who'd known her since she was a child and was now seeing something she didn't like. "Clara," she said, "when did you last have a proper meal?" "I eat," Clara said. "That's not what I asked. I eat enough." She set the bread down on the counter. 2 white and 1 rye. I'm not talking about the bread. Mrs. Delaney had the particular directness of older women in small towns who have decided that social delicacy is wasted time. "You look like you've been poorly for a month. Are you well?" "I'm fine." "You're not fine. You've got shadows under your eyes and you're holding yourself like everything aches." Clara looked down at the counter. "I've been working hard." "You've always worked hard. This is different." Mrs. Delaney paused. "Is this about the Aldridge business?" The question sat in the air between them. Clara didn't answer it, which was an answer. "Clara," Mrs. Delaney's voice had gone softer, "whatever that man said to you—" "He has conditions," Clara said flatly. "I'm meeting them. That's all it is." She picked up her empty basket and went back to the bakery, and she made herself not think about the expression on Mrs. Delaney's face, because Mrs. Delaney's expression was pity, and pity was one more thing she couldn't afford right now. The summer was brutal that year, the kind of heat that cracked the earth and made the horses stand very still in the shade. Clara was at the bakery by 4 every morning, in front of ovens that added to the already punishing temperature, and she was doing it on a body that was running on less and less. She started fainting. The first time she put it down to the heat. She was pulling bread from the oven and the room tilted and she sat down hard on the floor and sat there for a minute, breathing, and then got back up and finished the bread and told herself it was nothing. The second time happened in front of a customer, a farmer's wife who came in regularly and whose name Clara could never remember. She was making change at the counter and the edges of her vision went dark, and she grabbed the counter and the woman said, "Good Lord, are you all right?" With such alarm that Clara made herself stand straight and smile and say yes, just the heat, absolutely fine. She started sitting down more between tasks. She started timing things differently, allowing herself a minute here and there. She was efficient enough that she could do this without anyone noticing any change in the work, and this became its own kind of grim triumph, that she could hide how bad it was and still produce the same number of loaves, the same quality, the same careful decoration on the special orders. She was disappearing, and no one was stopping her because they thought she was becoming more. Preston Aldridge came into the bakery in August. He came in like he owned the place, which was something rich men did in small towns, an unconscious ease that took up space in a room. He looked around with mild curiosity, as if he hadn't been past this building 100 times. He bought a cinnamon roll. Clara wrapped it without speaking more than necessary. She was aware of him watching her in that same assessing way from the parlor, except now his expression was different, less critical. There was something almost approving in it, which was worse than the criticism, she found. "You've done good work," he said. She wasn't sure if he meant the cinnamon roll or herself. She suspected himself. "Thank you for your business," she said. He lingered. She waited. "I've been talking to my mother," he said, "about setting a date." Something moved in her chest that she couldn't quite identify. It wasn't happiness. "I see," she said. "You've held up your end." He said it like she'd honored a contract, which she supposed was accurate. "I'll have my mother call on your father next week." "All right." He looked at her for another moment, and she looked back at him, and neither of them said anything about the preceding months, about what she'd done to herself or why, about the fact that she had changed her body at the instruction of a man who had barely spoken to her, who saw her as a proposition to be satisfied rather than a person to be known. "Good cinnamon roll," he said, and left. Clara stood at the counter for a long moment after the door closed, the receipt still in her hand. She should have felt relief. That was the appropriate emotion. She'd done what was asked of her. The problem was solved. The future was being arranged. What she felt instead was a strange numbness, and underneath it, very small, very quiet, the way a crack is small and quiet before it becomes a fracture, something that might have been rage. She didn't listen to it, not yet. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a series of preparations that Clara moved through as if standing slightly outside herself. Margaret Aldridge came to call, as promised, and she and Harlan sat in the parlor above the bakery and discussed terms and dates and arrangements. And Clara was included in this conversation in the same way a piece of furniture is included in a room: present, referred to, not consulted. The wedding was to be in October. The church at the far end of the street, with its bell tower and no bell. Half the town invited, because the Aldridges invited half the town to everything. It demonstrated the breadth of their connections. Clara was fitted for a dress at Mrs. Pullman's shop. She stood on the little fitting platform and let Mrs. Pullman's assistant move pins around her, and Mrs. Pullman said, "You're going to be lovely, Clara," with such apparent sincerity that Clara almost believed her. She kept the bakery running through all of it. She had considered what would happen to the business after the wedding and hadn't been able to get a clear answer from anyone. Preston, when she'd asked, had shrugged and said he supposed she could keep it going if she wanted to, though he thought she'd be busy enough with the house. His mother had said something similar, slightly more diplomatically. Harlan had said the income wouldn't be necessary, not with the Aldridge money in the picture. Clara thought about the bakery, about the ovens, about the smell of the bread, about the farmer's wife whose name she couldn't remember who came in every week, about Mrs. Delaney and her rye order, about the way the morning light came through the flour dust and made everything look like something else. And she thought she was going to lose it, and she didn't know what she was going to be without it. But she'd gotten this far. She would keep going. Yeah. The night before the wedding, she ate a good supper for the first time in months. She sat in her kitchen above the bakery and ate bread with butter and a bowl of soup and a piece of apple cake that she'd made for the wedding reception. And she ate it carefully and slowly, like someone testing unfamiliar ground. It was the most ordinary meal she'd had in longer than she could clearly remember, and it made her want to cry, except she was too tired to cry, so she just sat with the feeling and let it move through her and then went to bed. She lay in the dark for a long time, listening to the buildings settle around her, the familiar sounds of the bakery below, the creak of the cooling ovens, the shift of wood in the quiet. She thought about her mother, who had stood in this same kitchen and baked and taught her to bake and had never said a word about the size of her body or the acceptability of her appearance. Her mother had talked about texture and timing and the way you could tell bread was right by the sound it made when you tapped the bottom of the loaf. She thought about the cinnamon roll she'd made this morning, left on the rack, which would still be good tomorrow and might as well be eaten. She got up and went downstairs in the dark and ate the cinnamon roll standing at the counter with no candle, in the warm dark of the bakery, by herself. It tasted exactly like it was supposed to. She had made it that way. Outside, Dust Hollow was quiet. The street was empty and silver in the moonlight, and the bell tower at the far end stood against the sky, its empty frame not waiting for anything in particular, just there. She stood in the dark bakery and ate, and for a few minutes she didn't think about anything except how the cinnamon roll tasted and the sound of the night outside, and the particular kind of quiet that comes before things change. She didn't know yet what was coming, but she had made it this far and the bread was good, and she was still standing. The morning of the wedding, Clara Whitmore woke before the alarm she hadn't set, in the dark, with the particular alertness of someone whose body has learned to distrust sleep. She lay still for a moment, taking stock of herself the way she'd gotten in the habit of doing, checking for the dizziness before she moved, the way you check for ice before you step. The room was gray, just beginning to gather light at the window's edge. Downstairs, the bakery sat cold and dark. She hadn't started the ovens. For the first time in 4 years, there was no reason to. She was getting married today. She sat up slowly and put her feet on the floor and looked at her hands in her lap. And what she felt was something she didn't have a precise word for. It wasn't dread, exactly. It wasn't joy. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of a decision she'd already made, looking back at the ground she'd covered to get there, and finding that the distance surprised her. She'd done what was asked. She had whittled herself down to the dimensions someone else specified, and now it was the day the bargain came due. She was supposed to feel something clean about that. She didn't. She dressed without a mirror, put her hair up, went downstairs and stood in the empty bakery for a few minutes, not doing anything, just standing in the familiar smell of flour and old warmth. Then she picked up her coat and went out into the October morning to get married. Bobby. The church was full by the time she arrived, which she hadn't expected and which immediately made everything worse. She'd known the Aldridges invited half the town, but seeing it, the pews filled, the faces turning toward the door when she entered, hit differently than knowing it. It was a lot of people. It was a lot of people looking at her at once, and she walked the aisle with her father's arm stiff under her hand and her face arranged into something she hoped read as composed. Preston was at the front, standing with the minister and his best man, a cousin from out of county who Clara had met once and whose name she'd already lost. Preston was wearing a good dark suit, and he looked like he belonged in a situation like this, comfortable with the eyes on him, at ease in his own standing. He looked at her as she approached. She looked back. There was a moment where she thought she saw something shift in his expression, something that might have been a flicker of actual recognition, of seeing her as a person rather than an outcome. But it was brief and then it was gone, and she might have invented it. She took her place beside him. The minister began. She never knew afterward exactly what made Preston say it when he did, whether it was a plan he'd had or something that came to him in the moment, or whether there was some cue she'd missed, some quality in her face or her posture or the fit of her dress that landed wrong for him and tripped something loose. What she knew was that the minister had asked the question, the old formal language about whether anyone present had cause why these two should not be joined, and the pause that was meant to be ceremonial, the pause no one was supposed to fill, had stretched. And then Preston said, "Actually." The word fell into the church like a stone into still water. Clara felt it in her chest before she understood it. He turned to face her. Not the congregation, not the minister. Her. As if this were a private conversation that happened to have an audience of 60 people. "Clara," he said. His voice was level. He wasn't cruel about it, which somehow made it worse. "I've been thinking about this, and I don't think I can do it." She stared at him. "What?" "I've been thinking about what marriage means, practically, what it looks like, and I look at you." He stopped. Started again. "You're not what I need. I need someone who presents well. Someone who's... I need a woman who..." He seemed to be searching for the word. "You're a baker. You run a shop. You're... Preston." The minister, a short man with a gray beard, said it with the alarm of someone watching a horse bolt through a fence line. "I'm being honest," Preston said, not looking at the minister, still looking at Clara. "I'd rather say it now than live with it." The silence in the church was unlike any silence Clara had ever been in. It had weight. It pressed against her ears. She was aware of her father somewhere to her left, aware of Margaret Aldridge in the front pew, aware of 60 people arranged in rows behind her, aware of every one of them. She was aware of her own dress, her own careful hair, her own hands, which had gone very cold. "You're telling me no," she said. Her voice came out very quiet. "In front of all of these people. I'm trying to be honest." "You waited until now." She wasn't asking. She was just saying it because her brain was doing the thing it did when something was too large to hold, breaking it into parts, observing each part. He had waited until now. He had let her walk down the aisle. He had let 60 people come to witness this. "You could have told me yesterday. You could have told me a month ago. I wasn't certain until... You could have told me before I spent 5 months." Her voice cracked on the last word, which she hadn't meant. She stopped. She heard someone in the pews behind her make a sound. She didn't know what kind of sound. It didn't matter. Preston had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable, though not enough. "I'm sorry," he said. "That's all I can say." Clara looked at him for another moment. Then she looked at her father, who was standing to her left with his face red and his eyes doing something complicated that she couldn't read. Was it anger at Preston? At her? Was he working out how this reflected on him? She thought, "I have to leave this building." She turned and walked back down the aisle. She didn't run. She kept her back straight and her chin level, and she walked past 60 faces turned toward her with 60 different expressions: shock, pity, curiosity, and in at least a few cases, an avid and unhidden fascination that made her stomach turn. And she pushed out the double doors into the October air and kept walking. She didn't stop. She didn't know where she was going. She walked past the front of the church and around the side and behind it, onto the open ground that ran out toward the scrubland east of town. And she walked until the sound of the church was behind her, and the ground underneath her feet changed from packed dirt to dry grass and small stones. Then she stopped. The sky was enormous out here. It always was. Away from town, with nothing to interrupt the view in any direction. Just open country, bleached grass, the ridgelines in the distance, the blue overhead with a few high, thin clouds moving fast. The wind was cold and smelled like dust and dry sage. She stood in it for a long time and breathed. She didn't go back to the church. She didn't go back to the bakery, not right away. She walked east into the scrubland without a clear plan, following the rough ground because it was something to do, because standing still was unbearable, and the town behind her was unbearable, and she needed something to put between herself and what had just happened. The land out here was unfamiliar to her. She kept to what seemed like a path, though it was probably just a route that cattle had used at some point, worn into the ground by repetition rather than intent. The scrub was thigh-high in places, dry and rustling in the wind. The ground was uneven, rocks and sudden dips that caught her feet. She walked in a dress and good boots, which was exactly wrong for this terrain. But she didn't think about that until she'd been walking for nearly an hour, and her boots were rubbing and the hem of her dress was torn on a low thorn bush. The cold had settled into something steady. Her coat was good, but not good enough for this pace and this wind, and at some point the exertion of walking stopped generating warmth, and she started to feel the temperature in a real way, in her fingers, and her face, and the back of her neck. She sat down on a flat rock and looked at the ground between her feet. The thing she hadn't let herself feel in the church, the full size of it, started to come through now, in the quiet of the scrubland with no one watching. Not grief, exactly. Something more disorganized than grief. The months of it, the calculation, the discipline, the cold mornings, and the headaches, and the dizziness, and eating the cinnamon roll in the dark by herself the night before, like a person making peace with something. All of it in service of a man who had stood in front of a congregation and decided she still wasn't what he needed. She thought about the sound her voice had made when it cracked. She hadn't wanted it to crack. She had not wanted to give him that. She put her face in her hands and stayed like that for a while. When she looked up, there was a man watching her from about 20 yards away. He was standing at the edge of a low fence line, wire strung between cedar posts, the kind that marked grazing land, with one boot on the bottom wire and his arms resting on the top, the posture of a man who'd been there a few minutes and had decided not to announce himself. He was tall, lean in the way of people who work outdoors, with dark hair under a worn hat, and the kind of face that had spent enough time in the sun that it was hard to determine much else about it from this distance. He wasn't from town. She was almost certain of that. Clara straightened and looked at him. "Sorry," he said. He had a low, even voice that carried across the distance without effort. "Didn't mean to startle you. I came out to check the fence and you were already here." "This is your land?" "North of the fence is." He nodded in her direction, meaning south of it. "That side is open range." "I didn't know I'd crossed a line." "You didn't. I'm not coming out here to chase you off." He seemed slightly awkward about this, as if he'd started a conversation and wasn't sure of its direction. "You all right?" "I'm fine." He looked at her dress, at her coat, at the general condition of someone who had walked out of a church in formal clothes and kept going for an hour across rough country. He didn't say anything about what he saw. "There's a spring about a quarter-mile east," he said instead. "Clean water if you need it, and there's a stand of cottonwoods that cut the wind." She looked at him for a moment. "Why are you telling me that?" "Because you look like you've been out here a while and it's getting colder." He said it simply, without any performance of concern. "That's all." She stood up, brushing dust from her dress. "I don't need guidance." "I didn't say you did." Still that same even tone. "Just telling you what I know about this piece of ground." She picked up her coat where it had slipped from her shoulders and put it back on. She looked at him again, this man leaning on his fence in the cold, who had apparently decided that seeing a woman crying alone in the scrubland was not something to remark on. "What's your name?" she asked. "Ryder Cole." A pause. "You're the baker, from town." "Clara Whitmore." He nodded. "I've bought bread from your place. Not recently, but the rye loaf. Good bread." She almost laughed. She didn't, but she almost did. "Thank you." "The spring," he said again. "Quarter-mile east, if you want it." Then he shifted back from the fence and went back to checking his wire, working the post, testing tension, not looking at her again, as if he'd said his piece and had other things to attend to. Clara stood there for a moment. Then she walked east. The spring was where he'd said, in a low place in the ground where the earth stayed wet enough to support a stand of cottonwoods. Their leaves mostly gone now, shaking in the wind. The water came up clear from between two flat stones, cold enough to hurt her teeth when she cupped some in her hand and drank. She sat against one of the cottonwood trunks out of the worst of the wind and let herself be still. She stayed there for a long time, long enough that the light shifted and the shadows moved, and she understood that a significant portion of the day had passed, long enough that she'd thought through the immediate situation. The wedding that wasn't, her father's likely response, the 58 people who had witnessed it and who would talk about nothing else for weeks, without arriving at any conclusions, but having at least looked at the thing from multiple angles. There was no good version of going home. She understood that clearly. Home meant the bakery and the room above it, and Harlan Whitmore's face. And she didn't yet know what Harlan's face was going to look like, but she had some sense of the shape of it, and none of the options were easy. She heard boots on the dry ground and looked up. Ryder Cole was coming down the slope from the north, carrying something. He stopped at what seemed like a respectful distance, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough to make clear he wasn't pressing. He had a canteen and something wrapped in cloth. "Rode past and saw you were still here," he said. "Figured you might want this." He held up the canteen. "Coffee. It's not hot anymore, but it's not cold either." He held up the cloth. "Biscuits." She looked at him. "You made biscuits." "I made biscuits this morning. I had some left." He set both things down on a flat rock near her and didn't come any closer. "I'm not trying to—" He paused, finding words carefully. "I'm not trying to do anything except leave you some coffee and biscuits. You can leave them there if you want." She picked up the canteen and drank. The coffee was exactly as described. Not hot, not cold, somewhere in between, strong and slightly bitter, and real, in a way she hadn't expected. She drank more of it. "Thank you," she said. He sat down on the ground about 6 feet away, back against a cottonwood, and pulled his hat down a little against the wind. He didn't say anything. After a while, she said, "You're not going to ask?" "Ask what?" "Why I'm out here." He considered this. "Figured if you wanted to tell me, you would." She unwrapped the cloth. The biscuits were dense and plain, the kind you make when you're cooking for yourself and not for show. She ate one, and it was fine, not brilliant, slightly underdone in the middle, but she ate it. "I was supposed to get married today," she said. "I know." He said it without inflection. "News travels." "Small place." He was quiet for a moment. "The Aldridge boy." "Yes." Another pause. Ryder Cole seemed to have made a practice of not filling silence with unnecessary words, which Clara found she didn't mind as much as she'd expected. "He stood up in front of the whole church," she said. Not because she needed to say it, but because she was testing the sound of it, seeing if it got lighter with telling. In front of everyone who was there, she ate another bite of biscuit. "He said I wasn't what he needed." Ryder was quiet for a moment. "What do you need?" he said, and it took her a second to realize he meant it literally, not philosophically, not rhetorically. What did she need right now, this afternoon? "I don't know," she said. "I think I need to sit here for a while longer." "All right," he said. And he stayed, because she hadn't said she needed to sit there alone, and apparently he'd registered that. The sun was low by the time she finally stood up and said she needed to go back. Ryder walked her back to the fence line and showed her the easiest route from there toward the east road into town, the one that came in from the backside and didn't go past the church. She thanked him for the coffee and the biscuits and the directions. He said it was no trouble. "Your fence is loose at the 7th post," she said. "I noticed when I came past." He turned back to look at her. Something in his face shifted. Not a smile exactly, but something in the vicinity of it. "I'll check it." She walked back toward town in the failing light, her dress hem-ruined and her boots rubbing and her hair half down from its pins. And she thought about the afternoon, which had been one of the worst of her life, and also, and she was aware of how strange this was, had included half an hour sitting against a cottonwood tree with a man who had brought her coffee without being asked and hadn't said a single unnecessary thing. She didn't know what to make of Ryder Cole. She didn't try to, not then. What she thought about instead, walking the back road into Dust Hollow, was the question he'd asked. What do you need? She hadn't had an answer, but she noticed it was the first time in months someone had asked her that, and meant her, not the situation, not the arrangement, not the outcome. Not what does this require of you, but what do you need? It was a small thing. She turned it over anyway. Passa. Harlan was waiting in the bakery. He was sitting at the table in the back room with his hands flat on the surface, the way he sat when he was containing something he hadn't decided what to do with yet. He looked up when she came in through the back door, and the expression on his face was exactly as complicated as she'd anticipated. Anger, yes, but underneath it something that took her a moment to identify as embarrassment, which surprised her because her father's shame generally converted itself into other people's fault before it had time to register. "Where have you been?" he said. "Out. All day." "Yes." She hung up her coat and turned to face him. "All day." He looked at her, at the dress, at the state of her. "Clara, don't. Someone needed to. Don't." Her voice was quiet, but she meant it, and something in the quality of it made him stop. She'd never heard that in her own voice before, not exactly. Not that particular kind of quiet, that wasn't soft, that was something else. He stopped. She put water on for tea. She moved around the kitchen doing small tasks, needing her hands to be occupied. "What did he say to you?" Harlan asked, finally, from behind her. "You were there." "I mean after. Did he say anything to you after?" "No." She hadn't spoken to Preston after. She'd walked out and Preston had, she assumed, remained in the church and managed the aftermath of what he'd done, which was his problem and not hers. "He said what he said in front of everyone, and then I left." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "His mother came to speak to me." Clara looked at him. "She apologized," he said. He seemed to not quite know where to put this information. Margaret Aldridge apologized, right there in the church, in front of however many people were left. Said Preston had made a decision she didn't agree with. "Good for her," Clara said, without feeling. "She seemed sincere." It doesn't matter if she was sincere. "Clara, it's done, Papa." She poured the water. "It's done, and I'm not going to talk about it tonight. I'm going to have tea and go to bed, and tomorrow I'm going to open the bakery, and that's what I'm going to do." Harlan looked at her for a long moment. He opened his mouth and she thought he was going to say something about what she should do next, or something about the money, or something about her prospects, all of which she was absolutely not able to receive tonight. Instead he said, "I'll take the tea if there's enough." She poured him a cup. They sat at the table and drank it without talking much, which was the closest thing to comfort she was going to get from him, and she took it. She reopened the bakery the next morning. She'd half expected that people wouldn't come, or that they'd come with looks she couldn't bear. She'd expected the thing small towns do, where the air in every room becomes charged with the thing no one is saying. She'd braced for it. Some of that was there. There were customers who came in and didn't quite meet her eyes and paid and left quickly. And she knew that later today they'd be somewhere talking about her, and she tried not to think about what they'd say. There was Dora Hicks, who came in at 10 and bought a loaf of bread and said, "Chin up, Clara," in a tone that managed to be both sympathetic and deeply satisfying, as if Clara's humiliation were something Dora had been half expecting and was now generously rising above. But Mrs. Delaney came in before 8, before the full morning rush, and bought her rye as always and then stood at the counter for a moment. "I heard what happened," she said. "I assumed you had." "He's a fool," said flatly as a statement of fact. "And a coward." "What he did?" She shook her head. "A man with any real character would have spoken to you privately, not in front of a church full of people. He said he was being honest. He was performing honesty," Mrs. Delaney said, with a precision Clara appreciated. "There's a difference." She picked up her bread. "Your bread is still the best in the county, and it was yesterday, and it'll be tomorrow. That's not nothing." Clara looked at her. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. It's just true." She went to the door. "And eat something. You still look like you need to eat something." Clara did eat something. She ate a proper breakfast, standing in the kitchen before the shop opened, more than she'd let herself eat in months. She was aware, eating it, of a slow and somewhat reluctant understanding that the conditions under which she'd been reducing herself were over. The arrangement was gone. The conditions were gone. She could stop. It didn't feel like freedom yet. It felt more like a room where the furniture had been rearranged in the dark, and she kept reaching for things in the wrong places. Her body had gotten used to a certain way of being treated. It was going to take time to trust that this had changed. But she ate the breakfast. That was something. Ryder Cole came into town on a Thursday, 10 days after the wedding that hadn't been. He had supplies to get from the general store, a harness to take to the leather worker, ordinary business. He came past the bakery on his way and paused at the door. She was behind the counter when he came in, and she looked up and recognized him with a small, involuntary adjustment of something inside her. Surprise, maybe, at seeing him in this context, in town, in a room rather than in open country. "Mr. Cole," she said. "Miss Whitmore." He took off his hat. "Came to buy bread, if you've got rye." "I have rye." He looked around the bakery, taking it in with the same unhurried quality he'd had out by the fence line. His eyes went to the bread racks, the display case, the hand-painted menu on the wall. "Nice place," he said. "Thank you." She wrapped the rye and told him the price, and he paid it, and then he didn't immediately leave. He stood with the bread under his arm and seemed to be working something out. "How are you doing?" he asked. Direct, no inflation around it. "Better?" she said. She thought about it. "Better than the other day." "Good." He nodded, as if this was the answer he'd hoped for. "The spring will freeze in another few weeks," he said. "If you want to sit out there in the cold, you'll have to find somewhere else." The laugh that came out of her was small and surprised, and it felt like something shaking loose. "I'll keep that in mind." He almost smiled. She was starting to understand that this was Ryder Cole's equivalent of a grin. "Good bread," he said, and went. She watched the door close and stood for a moment in the empty bakery with her hands on the counter, and something that wasn't quite hope, wasn't quite expectation, but occupied some of the same space in her chest. The morning light was coming in at an angle, the way it did in October, long and sideways and going gold. It hit the flour dust and made it look like the air was full of something fine and suspended. She went back to work. He came back the following Thursday. And the one after that. The pattern established itself without much discussion. He came on Thursdays when he came into town for supplies, bought rye bread, sometimes bought other things. A pie, when she had pie, a dozen rolls once, saying he had men working on a fence project and could use them. He stayed a few minutes each time, and they talked, and the talking got easier in increments, the way things do when two people are being careful with each other for reasons neither has fully explained. She learned things. He ran a cattle operation on about 400 acres, mostly beef stock, about 3 miles east of town. He'd been out here 10 years, came originally from further east, didn't say much about that. He had 2 men who worked for him seasonally and a horse he called Carson that he seemed to think highly of, though he described Carson's qualities with the same level tone he used for everything. So you only understood it was affection if you were paying attention. He asked her things too, about the bakery, about the business, practical things. How did she manage orders? How far did people come to buy? What was her best season? He asked about these things the way someone asks who is actually curious, and she found herself talking more than she usually did, partly because the questions were good ones, and partly because it had been a while since anyone treated the bakery as a serious subject worth understanding. One Thursday in November, he came in and she could see something was off before he said anything. Some tightness around the eyes, some fraction more stiffness in how he moved. "What happened?" she asked. He looked at her. "Fence came down in the northwest corner overnight. Lost about 8 head into the Granger property." He put his hat on the counter. "Spent the morning dealing with Tom Granger about it." "Tom Granger's not easy." "No, he's not." He was quiet for a moment. "He's not wrong either, which makes it worse. They were my cattle on his land." "Did you get them back?" "Yes. Cost me." He didn't elaborate on what it cost. "It's fine. It's done." She put a piece of pie in front of him. She hadn't said she was going to do this. Her hands just did it. He looked at the pie, then at her. "I didn't order that," he said. "I know." She picked up a cloth and went back to wiping down the counter. "It's the end of the day. It'd go to waste." A pause. "Is that true?" There are 4 pieces left. She kept her back mostly to him. 2 of them have my name on them and one's for Mrs. Delaney. The math works out. She heard something that might have been a quiet sound of amusement. When she glanced over, he was eating the pie. "Peach," he said. "Last of the summer preserves. It's good." "I know it is." He glanced at her and she glanced at him, and for a moment they were both almost smiling. Almost. And the bakery was warm and smelled like bread, and the light outside the window was the low gray of November settling in. "I'll pay for the pie," he said. "No, you won't." "Clara, shh." "Ryder." She said his name without thinking about it, just using it, and he stopped. "It's pie. Just eat the pie." He ate the pie. He didn't argue. She noted this because it was the kind of thing worth noting about a person, that they could accept something without making it complicated. She still didn't know what to make of him. She was starting to think that might not matter as much as she'd thought. That sometimes people came into your life and the right thing to do was simply let them be there. See what that looked like over time. Stop trying to measure it against some outcome before you had enough information. Outside, November was doing what November did. Inside the bakery, the ovens were warm and the bread was good, and Ryder Cole was sitting at her counter eating peach pie and not saying anything complicated, and that was enough for today. She let it be enough. The Thursdays became the steadiest thing in Clara's life that winter, which said something about the state of her life, but also something about Ryder Cole. He was consistent in the way that certain reliable things are consistent, not predictable in a dull sense, not the same conversation repeated, but reliably himself, which Clara had come to understand was rarer than it sounded. He came on Thursdays, bought bread, stayed 20 minutes or so, talked about what was happening on the ranch, and asked what was happening at the bakery. He didn't perform. He didn't say things he didn't mean in order to smooth the air. When she asked him a question, he answered it straight, and when he disagreed with something she said, he said so without making it into an argument. December came in cold, and the bakery became the warmest place on the main street, and people came in partly for bread and partly just to stand near the heat, which was fine with Clara. Warm bodies in the shop meant sales, and sales meant she could pay her accounts and keep the ovens running and not have to think too hard about what the future looked like. The future was a thing she was trying not to look at too directly, not because it frightened her exactly, but because it was shapeless in a way that made her uneasy. Before the wedding, that wasn't, she'd had a shape. Not one she'd chosen, but a shape nonetheless. Now there was open country in every direction, and she was still learning how to move in it. She was eating better. That much was clear and real, and she held on to it. Mrs. Delaney had stopped watching her with that particular careful expression, which Clara took as a sign. She had more energy in the mornings. The headaches had mostly stopped. She baked a new recipe in November, a spiced molasses cake with a brown sugar crust. And it was good, and she knew it was good from the moment she pulled it from the oven, and that certainty felt like something coming back online in her, some instrument that had been knocked offline and was now reading correctly again. She didn't talk to anyone about the months before the wedding, not in detail. Mrs. Delaney knew enough and didn't push. Ryder knew almost nothing about it and didn't ask. Harlan never brought it up, which might have been tact and might have been avoidance and was probably some mixture of both. She carried it herself, quietly, and tried to understand what had happened to her, not in a dramatic sense, not as tragedy, but as information. She had done a thing. The thing had been done to her and she had allowed it, and had even cooperated with it, and understanding why that was true and what it meant about how she saw herself was not a quick process. It was the kind of understanding that came in pieces, in the middle of the night or in the quiet middle of a baking shift, when her hands were occupied and her mind was loose, and it was uncomfortable in the way that honest things often are. What she came back to again and again was the moment in the parlor when Preston had said, "Turn to the side." And she had turned. Not because she wanted to, not because it made sense, but because her father had given a small nod, and she had absorbed, somewhere in the years of small signals and quiet corrections, that compliance was the price of being loved by the people who were supposed to love you without conditions. She thought about that a lot. She didn't resolve it, but she thought about it. He ticked. It was Ryder who told her about the Aldridges making trouble. He came in on a Thursday in December, and she could see before he said anything that he had something on his mind that wasn't bread. He bought his rye and stood at the counter turning his hat in his hands, which he didn't usually do. "There's a thing I heard," he said, "and I think you should hear it from someone who's not trying to do something with it." Clara set down what she was doing. "All right. Preston Aldridge has been talking." He said it without preamble. "Around town, in the saloon, at the feed store, saying things about you, about why he called off the wedding, that you'd been... He's framing it like you were the problem, like he was the one who made the sensible decision." She was quiet for a moment. "What does he say?" "That you were... He's saying you pursued him, that the whole thing was your idea and your father pushed it, and that he went along out of consideration and eventually realized you weren't what he'd been led to believe." Ryder said it flat and direct, his voice carrying no particular heat, which she appreciated because heat right now would have been hard to manage. "He's also saying things about your temperament, that you were difficult." Clara looked at the counter. She thought about the parlor with the lace curtains and the cattle painting, and Preston telling his mother she was heavy while she sat there in her best dress. She thought about the months that followed. She thought about the morning she hadn't recognized her own face in the window. "Of course he is," she said. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not." She picked up her cloth and found a section of counter that needed wiping, because her hands needed something. A man who does what he did in that church doesn't suddenly become honest about his own role afterward. She wiped the counter. "What are people saying?" "Mixed." Ryder watched her. "Mrs. Delaney's not buying it. The Briggs family at the saloon, his wife doesn't buy it either, I think, but there are people who..." He stopped. "Who believe him," she said. "Who are willing to," he said, which was more precise. "Because it's easier. Because it fits a certain kind of story they want to be true." She stopped wiping. "You came here to tell me this yourself on a Thursday, when you could have waited or not said anything at all." "Yes." "Why?" He thought about it for a moment, in that deliberate way he had of treating questions as things that deserved real answers. "Because it's going to come at you from other directions," he said, "and I thought it would be better to hear it straight, from someone who's not carrying it as gossip." He put his hat on. "And because it's not true, and that matters." Clara looked at him for a long moment. The bakery was quiet around them. Outside, the December street was nearly empty, the cold keeping people indoors. "It matters to you," she said. "Why it's not true." "Yes," he said simply. "It does." She didn't know what to do with that, so she thanked him and he left, and she stood in the bakery for several minutes after the door closed, not moving, thinking about the particular quality of being seen accurately by another person, how unfamiliar it was, and how much it cost her to receive it, and how that cost said everything about what the last several years had done to her. January was difficult. It wasn't that the rumors were everywhere. It was that they were enough. Enough that certain customers started coming in less, or started bringing with them a quality of distance that hadn't been there before. Not everyone. Not even most. But the ones who had been Preston Aldridge's social adjacents, the ones who attended the same dinners, whose families ran in the same circles, those customers became occasional where they'd been regular, became polite where they'd been warm. And the town had opinions, as the town always had opinions, and the opinions reached her in fragments. Someone mentioned something to someone who mentioned it to Mrs. Delaney, who didn't repeat it verbatim, but whose face when she came in told Clara enough. A woman at the dry goods store said something to the woman beside her, and they both looked toward the door just as Clara was coming through it, and the looking away was so abrupt it was worse than the looking. Harlan came to her in January with a tight expression and said he'd heard things. "I know," she said. "He's making you look bad." "I know." "Clara..." He stopped, started again. "What are you going to do about it?" She looked at her father, this man who had sat on a flour sack and told her about the Aldridge meeting as if he were scheduling an appointment, who had nodded in the parlor while a man told her to turn to the side, who had afterward told her it wasn't an unreasonable request. She looked at him and thought about all the ways she could answer that question and which one was true. "I'm going to make bread," she said. "That's what I'm going to do about it. I'm going to open the bakery and make bread and be here, the same as I've been, and wait for this to run its course. And if it doesn't run its course, then I'll figure something else out." He didn't like this answer. She watched him not like it. Watched him want a strategy, a move, something that addressed the situation with more force. Harlan Whitmore had always believed that problems were best solved by confronting them head-on in the manner of a man walking into a room expecting to be heard. The particular problem that his daughter's reputation was being damaged by a wealthy man's story was not one he knew how to confront, because confronting the Aldridges directly required resources and standing that he didn't have. And this limitation frustrated him in a way that turned outward. "You should have handled him better," he said. Clara turned back to the dough she was working. "Go home, Papa." "I'm just saying, but—" "I heard what you said." Her hands kept moving. "Go home." He went. She worked the dough for a long time after he left, feeling the resistance of it under her palms and pushing through, working it to the right texture. The texture you knew by feel and not by measurement. It was something she could do right. It was something that answered to her. Ryder kept coming on Thursdays. He didn't say much about the rumors. He mentioned once, in January, that he'd heard Briggs at the saloon push back on something Preston said. Had said it mildly, the way you report news, not the way you inflate it into meaning something larger than it does. Clara filed this away and thanked him. What she noticed, over those winter months, was how the conversation between them had changed without either of them deciding to change it. They'd started with the careful, courteous distance of strangers sharing an afternoon in open country. They'd moved through the easy back and forth of regular customers and their shopkeepers. And now it was something else, something she didn't have an easy category for. A frankness that had accumulated gradually, without either of them pushing it. He told her things about the ranch. Not the practical things only, not just fence repairs and cattle counts, but the other things. The aggravations, the small decisions that turned out wrong. The morning he'd found one of his best cows dead in the north field and hadn't been able to determine the cause and had stood there in the cold for longer than made sense, just standing there. She told him things too. Told him about the winter her mother was sick and they'd kept the bakery going together, her mother directing from a chair while Clara did the baking, learning faster than she'd ever learned anything, because necessity is the most efficient teacher. Told him about the time she'd accidentally put salt in a batch of sweet rolls instead of sugar and had sold 12 of them before anyone said anything, and how the embarrassment of that had lasted for weeks. He laughed at the sweet roll story. Actually laughed, which was different from the almost smiles she'd been cataloging. It changed his face. "What did you do?" he asked. "I knocked on 12 doors," she said, "gave everyone their money back and a replacement roll and apologized until they made me stop. All 12. All 12, she paused. Mrs. Carver on the end said she'd liked them, said the salt gave them character. He shook his head, still with the remnants of the laugh on his face, and she noticed she'd been watching him while he laughed and made herself look at something else. There was a careful conversation happening between them, one that neither of them had named. It was about whether they were moving towards something, and the carefulness of it was partly because of what had happened to Clara and what it had done to her trust in the intentions of people who showed interest in her, and partly because Ryder Cole was a man who seemed constitutionally disinclined to rush anything. She wasn't certain she minded the slow pace. She was still not certain of much, but she noticed the conversation was happening, and she didn't move away from it. In February, she started delivering to a homestead 6 miles out. The Pearson family, a husband and wife and 4 children who'd come out the previous spring and were settling a claim east of the ridge, had sent word through Mrs. Delaney asking if Clara might be able to bring bread on a regular basis, since the mother had a baby and coming into town wasn't always practical. Clara said she could, and worked out a route that didn't add too much time to her Thursday. She mentioned this to Ryder when she saw him because his land sat between the town and the Pearson place, and she wanted to know if the road through the eastern section was passable for a wagon in winter. Mostly, he said, there's one stretch that gets rough when it freezes. I'll show you. He showed her on a Thursday afternoon riding alongside her wagon on Carson while she drove, indicating where the road went soft and where to angle wider to avoid the worst of it. He did this without any sense that he was doing her a favor worth remarking on, which meant she didn't have to figure out how to receive the favor gracefully, which was a relief. The Pearson delivery became a Thursday thing alongside his visit, and sometimes he rode part of the way out with her before turning back, and sometimes he was already out that direction for his own reasons, and they went in something like tandem. This was not discussed or arranged. It was just what happened gradually, the way rivers find their paths. not by planning, but by following the terrain. Mrs. Pearson was a thin, tired woman with red-chapped hands and a quality of fierce determination that Clara recognized. She always had coffee on, and always insisted Clara take a cup before the return trip, and Clara always said she really shouldn't, and then always took the coffee, because Mrs. Pearson's need to provide something was as real as any other need, and Clara understood that. "Who's the man on the horse?" Mrs. Pearson asked one Thursday in February, looking out the window at Ryder waiting on Carson at the edge of the yard. "That's Ryder Cole," Clara said. "He has land out this direction." Mrs. Pearson looked at her. "Is he—" "He buys bread," Clara said. Mrs. Pearson's expression said she understood this to be an incomplete answer, but she was too well-mannered to say so directly. "He looks patient," she said finally, which Clara thought was one of the more accurate observations anyone had made about Ryder Cole, and she let the compliment sit without comment. The conversation she had been not having with Ryder happened in March, not as a formal conversation, but as a series of things that accumulated into one. It started when he came in on a Thursday and didn't buy bread immediately, but stood for a moment and then said, "Can I ask you something?" "You can ask me things," Clara said. "You do." "This is a different kind of thing." She waited. "I'd like to take you somewhere," he said. "Not here. Not in town. I'd like to—" He stopped, arranged his words. "There's a place on the eastern edge of my land where you can see the full ridgeline without anything in between. I've wanted to show it to someone for a while, and I'd like to show it to you." Clara looked at him. "That's what you wanted to ask?" "Yes." She thought about it. Not the question, but everything around the question. The fact that he was asking at all, when he could have found a way to make it happen without asking, could have offered it as practical rather than intentional. The fact that he'd been working up to it, she thought, which was not how he usually operated. "Why?" she said. He considered. "Because I think you'd appreciate it, and because I'd like to be the person who shows it to you." He paused. "And because I think you deserve to have things you like and places you want to go and people who want to take you there. And that's been missing for you for a while." The bakery was very quiet. Clara put her hands on the counter and looked at them. "You're going to make this hard on me," she said. "I'm not trying to. I know you're not." She looked up. "That's the part that makes it hard." He waited, because that was what he did. He was patient in a way that wasn't passive, that wasn't the patience of someone without options, but the patience of someone who had decided this particular thing was worth waiting for. "Yes," she said. "Show me the place." The following Sunday, he took her east on Carson while she rode the gentle mare she borrowed from the Delaney stable, and they went across his land to the eastern boundary where the ground rose and the view opened out. And it was as he'd said, the full ridgeline without a single obstruction, the sky enormous above it, the winter grass silver gold in the light, the ridges blue and layered with distance. She stood looking at it for a long time. "Well," she said. "Yes," he said. "You've been keeping this to yourself." "Didn't have anyone to show it to." She glanced at him, standing beside her with his arms crossed against the March cold, looking out at the same view. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the ridgeline, letting her look at it too, not making it into more than it was by watching for her reaction. She thought, this is a good man. Not a perfect man. Not a simple man. Not a man without his own difficulties and silences and the accumulated weight of 10 years living mostly alone on 400 acres of frontier land. But a good one. She didn't say anything about this. Instead, she said, "You can see at least 30 miles from here. On a clear day, more. I've lived here my whole life and didn't know this existed." "The town faces the wrong direction," he said. "Everyone looks west, toward the road in. Nobody looks east." She thought that was probably true about more things than geography, but she didn't say that either. They stood in the cold looking east, and after a while she felt him move slightly closer, just slightly, enough that the wind couldn't get between them anymore, and she didn't move away. Spring came early that year and caught everyone slightly off guard, the way early springs do. 1 week ice and frozen ground. The next week mud and tentative green pushing through the gray. The bakery's business began to stabilize. Not to recover entirely, not the same as before. Some of the customers who drifted away during the winter stayed away, And Clara had come to understand that this was how it was going to be, that the town had divided somewhat over the Aldridge business, and that division would not resolve quickly or completely. But the customers she still had were loyal, and the Pearson delivery had given her an idea about expanding to other outlying homesteads, and she was thinking carefully about what that might look like. She and Ryder had not defined anything between them. She was not sure definition was the right next step, or that she was ready for it. What they had was real, and she valued it, and she wasn't willing to rush it towards something formal while she was still rebuilding herself from the inside out. He seemed to understand this, or if he didn't understand it entirely, he respected it, which came to the same thing. What she hadn't expected was Preston Aldridge. She hadn't thought about him much in the months since October. She'd thought about the effect of him, the damage of him, the months that he had shaped without knowing her at all. But the man himself had faded in her mind to something impersonal, an occasion rather than a person. She'd heard he was spending more time at the county seat. She'd heard his name occasionally in the same way you hear weather reports. Present information, not particularly urgent. So she wasn't prepared for him to walk into the bakery on a Thursday afternoon in April. He came in and stood at the counter with a quality she couldn't immediately read. Not arrogant, not contrite, something in between, the expression of a man who had thought about what he was doing enough that he believed he was doing it right. Clara looked at him across the counter. "Miss Whitmore," he said. She didn't say his name. "What can I get you?" He glanced at the display case. "I'll take some of whatever you recommend." "You're not here for pastry," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said. "I'm not." He put his hands on the counter, not leaning, just placing them, as if he needed something to do with them. "I owe you an apology. A real one. Not the kind my mother made for me." The bakery had one other customer, a woman named Florence, who was examining the bread racks with what was now a somewhat unconvincing interest in the options. Clara was aware of Florence's ears. "You can come back another time," Clara said. "When it's not—" "I'd rather say it now," he said. "I've been putting it off for 5 months, and I'll keep putting it off if I leave." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Florence, your loaf is the sourdough on the second shelf." Florence turned, looking caught, and pointed at a loaf. "This one?" "Yes, same as always." Florence paid and left with what dignity she could manage, and the door closed, and the bakery was quiet. Clara crossed her arms. "Say it then." Preston had the grace to look uncomfortable. "What I did in that church, the way I did it, was wrong." He said it without circling. "I told myself I was being honest. I've thought about it, and I wasn't being honest. I was being a coward who wanted an audience so he wouldn't have to own the decision alone." He paused. "And what I said about your appearance in my mother's parlor, the things I required." He stopped again. This part was harder for him, and she watched him push through it. "You were a person. I treated you like a negotiation." The room was very quiet. "The things I said," he continued, "about you in the months after, that was also wrong. I was trying to protect my own version of the story." Clara stood very still and looked at him. She was aware of something moving in her chest that was not forgiveness, and was not acceptance, and was not warm, but was perhaps recognition. The recognition of a man who was telling the truth about something that reflected badly on him, without an obvious gain for doing so. "I know it doesn't fix anything," he said. "No," she agreed. "Is there—" He seemed to be looking for a question. "Is there anything I can do?" She thought about it genuinely, turned the question over. "Stop telling the story," she said. "The one you've been telling. Just stop. You don't have to correct it with everyone who heard it. Just stop adding to it." He nodded. "I can do that. That's all I want from you." He nodded again. "I'll take whatever you recommend," he said, and his voice was quiet. She put a cinnamon roll in a paper wrapper and handed it to him. He put coins on the counter and picked up the roll and went to the door, and paused. "For what it's worth," he said without turning, "Ryder Cole is a better man than I am." Clara said nothing. He left. She stood at the counter for a moment after the door closed. Her hands were steady. Her heart was doing something complicated that she didn't try to name. She thought about the parlor and the church and the October morning walking through scrubland in a wedding dress, And she thought about the spring and the view from the eastern ridge and the sound of Ryder almost laughing about the sweet rolls. She thought about all of it, how long it was and how much had happened, and then she picked up her cloth and wiped the counter clean and went back to work. Ryder came in at 5 o'clock, later than usual. "Heard Preston Aldridge was in," he said. "Florence," Clara said. "Florence," he agreed. "He apologized," she said. "A real one. Not a good one, not smooth or polished, but real." Ryder looked at her carefully. "How are you with that?" "I don't know yet." She leaned against the back counter. "He said you're a better man than he is?" Something moved through Ryder's face. "He might be setting a low bar." "He might be." She looked at him. "He's not wrong, though." The quiet in the bakery was the particular quiet of the end of the day. The ovens cooling, the light outside going golden and long. Ryder stood on the customer side of the counter, and she stood on her side, and the counter was between them. And then she thought, "There's a counter between us because I put it there and I keep standing behind it." She came around to the other side, just walked around the end of it, and stood in the open part of the bakery. Ryder looked at her. "I'm not completely healed from last year," she said. It was not easy to say. "I don't want to pretend I am. There are things that I'm still working on some things." "I know," he said. "I'm telling you so you know what you're getting," she said. "If you're getting anything, I'm not sure yet what we're doing." "We don't have to be sure," he said. "Not right now. I need you to be patient." "Clara." He looked at her directly, the way he had of making eye contact that was without agenda. "You've never had to ask me to be patient. I've been patient." She almost laughed. She did laugh, a little, and it was real. "You have," she said. "You've been aggravating about it, actually. It would have been easier if you were in more of a hurry." "Noted," he said. "I'll try to be more aggravating in general." She shook her head, and the laugh settled into something quieter and more real. And she was standing in the open part of her bakery in the gold afternoon light with the smell of bread in the air and a good man standing in front of her. And the road behind her was long and hard, and she had walked every inch of it herself, and she was still here. She reached out and took his hand. Not dramatically, just took it, the way you take hold of something you've been reaching toward for a while and have finally decided you're allowed to have. He held it. He didn't say anything. Outside, the spring afternoon was doing what spring afternoons do. Generous with light, loose with warmth, full of the particular promise of a season that comes back every year and somehow still surprises you. Inside the bakery, Clara Whitmore stood in the space she'd built and held on. Holding Ryder's hand in the bakery that afternoon was not a resolution. Clara understood that clearly, even in the moment, that it was a beginning of something, not a conclusion, and that beginnings were, in her experience, the part that required the most careful navigation. Easy to ruin a beginning, easy to rush it or misread it or let the weight of everything that came before collapse onto something new that hadn't yet grown strong enough to bear it. She was careful. He was patient. April moved into May and the spring deepened and the bakery got busy the way it always did when the weather turned and people started traveling again, coming through Dust Hollow on their way to and from the county seat, stopping for bread and pie and the cinnamon rolls that a traveling salesman once described, to Clara's private satisfaction, as the best thing he'd eaten west of the river. The delivery route was growing. The Pearson family had mentioned her to the Halverson homestead 5 miles further east, and the Halversons had mentioned her to the Brandt family beyond that. And by May, she had a Thursday route that ran 11 miles out and back and served 4 households reliably. She'd invested in a second delivery basket and had a standing arrangement to borrow Mrs. Delaney's mare on Thursdays, since her own wagon was slower than she wanted on the longer run. The economics of it were not dramatic, but they were real. The delivery income was replacing some of what the town's reduced goodwill had cost her. Not all of it, not yet, but enough that she stopped doing the anxious mental arithmetic every Sunday night before the week started. Enough to feel like solid ground under her feet rather than ice she was testing with each step. Ryder helped her think through the route logistics one Thursday evening in May, sitting in the bakery after closing with a cup of coffee and a piece of paper she'd been using to map the distances. "If you go to the Henderson place first instead of last," he said, tracing a line with one finger, "you'd cut about 1.5 miles off the total run. The road between the Pearson and Henderson properties connects without going back to the main road." I didn't know that road connected. It doesn't look like it connects. It's more of a gap in the fence that cattle have widened. He glanced up at her. I can show you. You say that about a lot of things on your land. My land covers a lot of territory. It does, she agreed, and looked at the map rather than at him, because she was aware of how easily they could slip into a comfortable domesticity that she wasn't sure either of them had fully chosen yet, or that she had, rather, since Ryder seemed to have made his choices in his own quiet way and was simply waiting for her to make hers. This was the part she couldn't quite resolve. She liked what was between them. She trusted it, which was more significant than liking it, given everything. She thought she knew him well enough now to know that the steadiness was real and not performed, that he was the same man whether he thought she was watching or not. She'd seen him be short-tempered once, in March, when one of his seasonal workers had left a gate unlatched and they'd spent a morning running down cattle. She'd heard about it from the worker, who'd come into the bakery looking somewhat chastened, and she'd asked Ryder about it directly, and he'd said yes. He'd been short with the man, more than he needed to be, and he'd apologized afterward. She'd filed that away. He lost his temper. He acknowledged it. He apologized. That was a normal man in a normal situation. She didn't want someone without temper. She wanted someone who owned it. But wanting Ryder Cole and being ready for whatever the next step meant were two different questions, and she was still working on the second one. The rumor reached her on a Tuesday in June through Mrs. Delaney, who came in for her rye with a quality about her that Clara recognized as the quality of someone who has information and doesn't know whether delivering it will help or hurt. Sit down, Clara said. There's coffee. Mrs. Delaney sat and accepted the coffee and wrapped both hands around the cup. I heard something yesterday, she said, and I've been deciding whether to tell you. Tell me. Dora Hicks was at the general store. She was talking to the Marchetti woman. You know the one, she's married to the man who runs the freight office. And she said, Mrs. Delaney paused. She said that you and Ryder Cole have been conducting a relationship that's improper, and that the whole town has known it for months, and nobody's saying anything because people feel bad for you after the Aldridge business. Clara held her coffee cup and looked at the table. She kept her face still. That's what she said. That's the shape of it. I'm telling you because if Dora's saying it at the general store, she's saying it elsewhere, and you ought to know before it's everywhere. What does improper mean, specifically? She was vague about specifics. Mrs. Delaney had the look of someone who'd wanted more precision and hadn't gotten it. The implication was that that Ryder has been. She made it sound like he's been taking advantage of your situation, of the fact that you're unmarried and your father has no money and you have. She stopped. That I have no other options, Clara said, something in that direction. Clara sat with this for a moment. She thought about Ryder bringing coffee to the cottonwood trees on the worst day of her life without being asked. She thought about him riding alongside her wagon to show her the rough patch in the road. She thought about 11 months of Thursday bread purchases and the Eastern Ridge, and the afternoon she'd walked around the counter and taken his hand. Dora Hicks, she said, has a very small imagination. She does, Mrs. Delaney agreed, but a large mouth. Is anyone listening to her? Some people. Mrs. Delaney was honest. People who were already looking for a direction to point. The Aldridge camp, mostly. Preston's friends, his family's connections. They want the story to be that you've been inappropriate all along, which excuses what Preston did. Clara stood up and went to the window. The main street of Dust Hollow lay in the June sun, the way it always had. The dirt baking, the storefronts leaning at their familiar angle, the bell tower at the far end against the blue sky with its empty frame. What do I do? She said. Not a question, exactly. More a thing she was saying to herself to see how it sounded. I don't know, Mrs. Delaney said, which Clara appreciated more than a confident answer would have been. I think you keep doing what you're doing. I think you don't hide, and you don't defend yourself against something that doesn't deserve defending against. But I'm an old woman who runs a boarding house, and I've been wrong before. Clara turned from the window. You're not usually wrong. I'm less wrong than Dora Hicks. That's not a high bar. Clara almost smiled. Thank you for telling me. I always will. Mrs. Delaney stood, picking up her coffee cup and then setting it down again. Clara, whatever you and Ryder Cole are or aren't, it's your business and no one else's. Don't let them make you feel ashamed of it. whatever it is. I'm not ashamed, Clara said, and found in saying it that it was actually true. Come, she told Ryder on Thursday. He listened without interrupting, which was ordinary for him, but the quality of his stillness was different than usual. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Dora Hicks, he said, and others, but she started it. She's carrying it for the Aldridge people, he said. That's what this is. I know. They want you discredited. He said it without heat, but very directly. If you look like a woman without morals, then what Preston said about you, the story he's been telling, becomes more believable retroactively. It protects the narrative. That's what I think, Clara said. Yes. He looked at her steadily. What do you want to do? I've been thinking about that. She'd been thinking about it since Tuesday morning. I think we need to be more visible, not less. If we're going to be talked about, I'd rather be talked about for what we actually are than for what they're inventing. He considered this. What are we? It was a straight question, and it deserved a straight answer. She'd known it was coming, had been preparing for it, and also not fully preparing for it, the way you can know a thing is coming and still find it arrives faster than you're ready for. I think we're two people who care about each other, she said, and who've been careful about it. And I think the being careful has gone on long enough that it's starting to look like hiding, and hiding is going to be used against us whether we're hiding or not. So stop hiding, he said. Stop hiding, she agreed. He nodded, slowly, as if working through the implications. I'm going to tell you something, he said, and I want you to hear it as information, not as pressure. Can you do that? I can try. I would marry you, he said, if you wanted to. Not because of Dora Hicks or Preston Aldridge or what the town is saying or what your father wants or any of that, but because I want to. I've known that for a while. He paused. That's the information. I'm not asking you anything right now. I just want you to know what's true for me. Clara looked at him across the bakery counter. That's the information, she said. Yes, she sat with it. She didn't answer it yet because he'd said he wasn't asking, and she believed him. And the fact that he could say it and then wait without the saying of it becoming a pressure was itself a piece of information about the kind of man he was. She filed it where she kept the important things, and she picked up her coffee and she said, "Come to dinner Friday, at my place, after closing." He looked at her. "In the open," she said, visible. "All right," he said. He came to dinner Friday. She cooked a real meal. Not bakery food, not what she made for customers, but an actual dinner with roasted chicken and root vegetables and bread that she made fresh that afternoon, just because she felt like it. She ate it at her own table with Ryder Cole sitting across from her, in the apartment above the bakery, with the windows open to the June evening. It was not a smooth dinner. The chicken was slightly overcooked on one side because she'd been watching it too closely and then gotten distracted by a conversation, and then it had been too late. She knocked over her water glass 20 minutes in, and Ryder moved his papers. He'd brought some surveying notes she'd asked to see related to the Eastern Road, fast enough that they didn't get soaked, and they both sat with the water spreading across the table for a moment before she went for a cloth. "So," she said, mopping it up. He said, helping. "That happened." Water does that. She looked up and he was almost smiling, which was enough, and she almost smiled back. And somehow the knocked-over glass made the dinner feel more real than any smooth version of it would have. Real things went wrong. Real things had sides that got too brown, and water that got knocked over, and two people who were still learning how to exist in a room together for an evening without the bakery counter as a fixed midpoint. They talked for 2 hours after the food was cleared. She told him things she hadn't told anyone. About her mother. About what it had been like after. About the particular way grief and responsibility can braid together into something you stop being able to separate. He told her about his first 2 years on the land, when he'd lost money 2 seasons running and had been close to selling and hadn't been able to explain to anyone why he didn't, why he'd kept going. He said he still wasn't entirely sure why. She said she thought she understood. He left at 9 o'clock because he was up at 4:30 and she was up at 4. And at the door he held her face for a moment and kissed her, and she let herself be kissed. And it was not a dramatic kiss, and it was not a romantic novel kiss, and it was also, without any question, a real one. "Friday again?" he said. "Yes," she said. The visible Friday dinners did not immediately quiet the talk. Clara hadn't expected them to. What they did was shift the nature of the talk, from speculation to something more concrete, from what are those two doing to the more manageable territory of those two are courting. The town had frameworks for courtship. It knew how to process it, even when it didn't approve of the particulars. The disapproval came mostly from predictable places. Harlan Whitmore, who came to the bakery in late June and sat across from Clara with the look of a man working up to something. "People are talking," he said. "People always talk," she said. "What specifically are they saying?" "That you've been having Ryder Cole to dinner every Friday." "Yes, alone. He's the only one I've been inviting. The only—" Harlan's jaw moved. "Clara, it's not proper. Not without— There should be someone present, a chaperone." "I'm 24 years old," Clara said, "and I run my own household." "Your reputation—" "My reputation," she said, "has already been managed by the people in this town for the better part of a year, and I've decided to stop letting that determine how I live." She said it without raising her voice. "I like Ryder Cole. He comes to dinner on Fridays. That's what's happening." Harlan looked at her like a man encountering a piece of furniture that has unexpectedly moved. "What about the future? What are his intentions?" "His intentions are his to state when he's ready." She picked up her cloth. "Are you buying anything today?" A pause. "I'll take a loaf of white." She wrapped it, and he paid, and he went to the door and stopped. "He's a decent man," Harlan said, as if the admission cost him something. "Yes," Clara said. "He is." Harlan left. She let out a slow breath and went back to work. The thing she hadn't anticipated came in July, and it didn't come from Dora Hicks or the Aldridge social circle. It came from her father, which was both surprising and, in retrospect, not surprising at all. Ryder told her. He came in on a Wednesday, not his usual day, and she could see from the set of his face that something had happened that he needed to say quickly rather than let sit until Thursday. "Your father came to see me," he said. Clara stopped. "When?" "This morning he rode out to the ranch." Ryder put his hat on the counter. "He came to ask me about my finances." The cold that moved through her was not anger yet, not quite. It was the particular sensation of recognizing a familiar pattern, just as it was beginning. "Tell me," she said. "He wanted to know what the ranch was worth, what my annual income runs, whether I had any debts." Ryder was watching her carefully. He said he was asking because any man who was courting his daughter needed to demonstrate he could provide, and he felt it was his right as her father to inquire. "And you said?" "I told him those were conversations I'd have with Clara, not with him." His voice was even, but there was something underneath it. Not anger, but the controlled version of something close. He didn't take that well. He said he had a legal standing to— I told him that legal standing and practical standing weren't the same thing and that Clara made her own decisions. "He threatened you," Clara said. "He implied he could make my business in town difficult if I wasn't cooperative." A pause. "He doesn't have that kind of standing, practically speaking, but he believes he does." She stood very still. She thought about her father, the man who had let her run the bakery alone for 4 years, who had sat on a flour sack and arranged a meeting with the Aldridges as if he were scheduling livestock for sale, who had nodded in the parlor. She thought about how far she'd come in understanding him and how far she still had to go, and she thought about the fact that this was going to require something from her that she hadn't yet decided she had. "I need to talk to him," she said. "I know." He picked up his hat. "I'm telling you first because it's your family and your call. What do you need from me about this?" He looked at her directly. "Nothing," he said. "I handled it. I'm telling you so you're not surprised." He paused. "And because if he does it again, I'd like you to know it's happened before." She nodded. He bought his bread and left, and she went to see her father that evening. The conversation with Harlan was one of the harder ones she'd had, which was saying something given the years she'd accumulated. He was at home, in the small house that was partly hers, and that it had been her mother's, and that she paid the rent on when Harlan's other income fell short, which was regularly. He was at the table with a glass of whiskey and the particular defensive posture of a man who expects to be confronted and has decided in advance that the confrontation is unfair. "Ryder told you," he said. "Yes." I have a right. Stop. She sat down across from him. I'm not going to argue about your rights. I want you to tell me why you went there. Because you won't tell me anything. You don't bring him here. I don't know what's happening between the two of you. Then ask me, she said. Come to me and ask me. I did ask you. You said it was your business. It is my business. She kept her voice level. But if you want to know, you ask me, not him. You don't ride out to his ranch and interrogate him about his income. Clara. Papa? She put her hands on the table. Look at me. He looked at her. I know you're worried. I know you want things to work out. I know that after the Aldridge business, I think you're afraid I'm going to make another decision that goes wrong. And some part of you thinks if you can control the circumstances, you can prevent that. She watched his face while she said this, watched the resistance, and underneath the resistance, something more real. But you can't control the circumstances. You couldn't the first time either. What happened with Preston happened because you put me in a situation I hadn't chosen, and I was trying to take care of you, and I'm the one who paid for it. Harlan was quiet. The whiskey glass sat untouched. You can't go to Ryder Cole's ranch and interrogate him, she said. Not because I'm forbidding it, because it's wrong. It treats me like I belong to you, and I don't. She paused. I love you. You're my father. But I've been taking care of myself, taking care of both of us, for 4 years. I need you to let me do that. He was quiet for a long time. What if he's not good for you? Harlan said finally. His voice was quieter than she'd expected. He is, she said. I know how to judge that now. I didn't used to, but I do. Another silence. Harlan picked up his glass, then set it down without drinking. He told me he'd have those conversations with you, he said. Not with me. He didn't say it unkindly, just like it was a plain fact. It is a plain fact, Clara said. I didn't like it. A pause. I think he's probably right. She looked at her father and saw, not for the first time but perhaps more clearly than before, that he was a man who had lost his wife and hadn't known how to rebuild, and had done the best he could with limited materials, and that the best he could was sometimes not enough and sometimes actively damaging, and that both of these things were true simultaneously. Don't go out there again, she said. I won't, he said. She didn't know if she believed him entirely, but it was something. The summer moved through July into August, and the delivery route continued to expand. She'd added a 5th homestead in July, the Winslow family, who'd heard about her from the Halverson clan and sent a letter asking about bread and anything else she could manage. She added a small cake order to the Winslow stop. She was trying to work out whether a second baking day for delivery-only orders made financial sense. She brought this problem to Ryder on a Friday evening, not because she needed him to solve it, but because she'd found she thought better with someone else in the room, someone who understood numbers and logistics and didn't have a personal stake in the answer. He looked at the figures she'd written out. The question is whether a second baking day costs you more in fuel and labor than the additional orders bring in, he said. Right, and I don't know yet because I don't have a full picture of what the demand would actually be. Could you test it? He handed the paper back. 1 extra day for a month. See what the real numbers look like. I've been thinking that. She'd been thinking it, but had been nervous about it, which was the kind of nervousness she didn't love in herself. The hesitation born of too many months when the stakes of every decision had felt enormous. I keep wanting the numbers to be certain before I commit. Numbers are never certain before you commit, he said. They're only certain after. I know that. You know it logically. You're not trusting it. She looked at him. How do you know the difference? Because you had it right in front of you on that paper and you spent 10 minutes explaining why you weren't sure instead of saying you were going to try it. She made a sound that was not quite a word. You're careful, he said. It's not a flaw, but you're being more careful than the situation requires. She considered this. He was right, and she didn't love that he was right, and she also appreciated that he said it directly without softening it into uselessness. Thursday extra day starting next week, she said. There you go. The Thursday extra day worked. The month's numbers came in better than she'd projected, mostly because Mrs. Winslow had mentioned the service to 2 additional homesteads that Clara hadn't reached yet, and both of them sent word asking about it. By the end of August, she had 7 regular delivery households and a route that ran 14 miles out and back and was starting to outgrow the mare she'd been borrowing from Mrs. Delaney. "You need your own horse," Ryder said. "I can't afford a good horse right now." "I have a horse you could use." She looked at him. "Before you argue," he said, "it's practical. I have more horses than I'm currently using since I let one of my seasonal men go in July. Carson's son, I've been calling him Colt, which is not a creative name. He's sound and he's steady and he's going to stand around eating if nobody's using him. I'm not taking your horse. I'm lending you a horse. There's a difference." He paused. "Clara, you're not taking charity. You're using a horse that would otherwise be idle. The horse benefits. The horse benefits. He'll get fat otherwise. Is that what you want? A fat horse?" She pressed her lips together. "Are you going to make everything into a version of this argument until I agree?" "Probably," he said. "Is it working?" It was working. She borrowed the horse, who was indeed steady and sound, and the route became manageable in a way it hadn't quite been before. She thought more than once about how Ryder's help worked. Not large and dramatic, not designed to make her feel indebted, but specific and practical and offered in the register of this is simply the sensible thing, which made it easier to accept. She did not expect what happened in late August, and neither, she thought, did Ryder. She found out through a customer set, not town gossip this time, but direct information, delivered by a man named Will Sutter, who had a homestead north of the Brandt place, and who came into the bakery on a Monday looking like a man who didn't know if he was delivering news or a warning. "There's a man been coming around," he said. He'd bought a loaf of bread and was standing at the counter not leaving. "Talking to homesteaders out east. Been out to us twice. Went to the Halverson place and the Pearson place that I know of." "What kind of man?" "Says he works for a land company. County seat," he said. "Been asking who's got title to what, who's been here how long, whether anybody's had trouble with their claim." Will Sutter set his bread down and looked at her. "And he's been asking about you." Clara went very still. "About me? About your deliveries? Which homesteads you go to? Whether the families depend on the service?" He seemed uncomfortable. "Miss Whitmore, I don't know what this man's after, but he asked Mrs. Halverson whether she'd still be able to get supply if your bakery was gone. Like he was trying to find out how much people need you out there." She kept her face from showing what she was feeling, because Will Sutter didn't need her alarm. He needed her to think clearly. "Did he give a name?" she said. "Randall something. I didn't catch the last name." "What company?" "He said Dunmore Land." Sutter paused. "Mean anything to you?" It didn't, not then. She thanked him, and he left, and she stood at the counter for a moment before she reached for her coat and her sign and flipped the door to closed, even though it was only 2 in the afternoon and she had another 3 hours of normal business. She needed to think, and she couldn't do it behind a counter waiting for customers. She went upstairs to the apartment and sat at the table with a piece of paper and wrote down everything Will Sutter had said, in order, because writing things down organized them, and organized things were less frightening than jumbled ones. She looked at what she'd written: a land company, asking about claims and titles, asking about her deliveries, asking whether the homesteads depended on her service. The last part was the thing that didn't fit, unless the purpose was to understand what would be disrupted if she wasn't there. She was still looking at the paper when someone knocked on the door at the bottom of the bakery stairs. She went down and opened it, and it was Ryder, earlier than Friday, with a quality about him that she recognized as the controlled version of something urgent. "You heard," she said. "Tom Halverson sent word." He came in and she closed the door. "Dunmore Land. You know that name?" "No, you?" "I've heard it." He was standing with his arms crossed, thinking. "They've been buying up claims east of the county seat. There were 2 homesteaders who had title disputes last year. I heard about it from the man who runs the freight office. He was handling papers for one of them. Both of them sold out eventually. I don't know if they wanted to." Clara looked at him. "The homestead's on my route." "Yes." "If someone wanted to pressure those families to sell," she said slowly, working through it, "and those families are depending on bread delivery to manage. If the delivery went away—" "It's not the only pressure," Ryder said, "but it's part of a picture. If those families are isolated enough, worried enough, without small supply chains they depend on—" He stopped. "I don't know if that's what this is." "What else would it be?" He didn't have another answer. Neither did she. She sat down at one of the bakery tables and he sat across from her, the same way they'd sat over the route map in May, except now the paper between them was what she'd written upstairs. And the problem was larger and less straightforward. "What do we do?" she said. "Find out more," he said. "I can ride to the county seat this week. Look into Dunmore Land, who they are, who's behind them, what they've bought, and how." He paused. "And I think you should talk to the homesteads, directly. Tell them what you heard, and let them tell you what they know. If I go talking about a land company, I might scare them." "They're already scared," he said. "The man came to their doors. They know something's happening. The question is whether they're alone in knowing it, or whether someone's paying attention." Clara looked at the paper on the table. She thought about Mrs. Pearson with her red-chapped hands and her fierce determination. She thought about the Halverson children she sometimes delivered an extra roll to, the littlest ones who came running when they heard the wagon on the road. She thought about 14 miles of delivery route that she'd built herself out of need and stubbornness and a dead-end road in Dust Hollow. "I'm going out Thursday," she said. "I'll talk to them. I'll go to the county seat Friday," he said. She nodded. She looked at the paper one more time and then turned it over because she'd gotten from it what she needed and she didn't want to look at it anymore tonight. "Stay for supper," she said. "It's not Friday, but stay." He stayed. She cooked and it was plain food, nothing she'd planned, and they ate it at the table in the apartment with the window open to the August evening, and they talked about what they knew and what they didn't and what the next 2 weeks might need to look like. At one point she said, "I built that route myself, 14 miles of it." "I know you did," he said. "If someone thinks they can unravel it by asking questions and making homesteaders nervous," she stopped. "They'll find out differently," he said. She looked at him. "Is that a promise?" "It's an observation," he said. "You're not someone who gives up what she's built. I've been watching you build it." She looked at him across the table, said, this man with his even voice and his patience and his borrowed horse and his 400 acres and his view of the eastern ridge. And she thought about all the things she hadn't known how to receive 6 months ago that she was learning how to receive now. "The information," she said. He looked up. "You told me in June that you'd marry me if I wanted." She kept her voice steady. "I've been keeping that in the right place, and I just want you to know I'm still keeping it. I haven't decided yet, but I'm keeping it." Ryder held her gaze. "I'll be here," he said, "when you decide." Outside, the August evening was warm and the town moved through its ordinary business on the street below, and somewhere 14 miles east of them, a set of families were worrying over land they'd worked and a company they hadn't asked about, and there was trouble coming, and they both knew it. But right now there was supper on the table and the window open to the night, and she was not alone, and the road ahead was hers to walk. She had built things from less before. Ryder came back from the county seat on a Saturday, 2 days after he'd said Friday, which told Clara before he'd said a word that what he'd found had taken longer to find than expected. She was closing the bakery when he rode up. She saw his face when he tied Carson at the post, and she went still for a moment and then finished turning the sign and opened the door for him. He sat at the bakery table and put his hat down and ran a hand through his hair, which was something she'd never seen him do, and she understood it as the gesture of a man who has been holding something difficult for 2 days and is relieved to be somewhere he can put it down. "Tell me," she said. "Dunmore Land Company," he said. "It's real, and it's been operating for 3 years. They work a particular way. They come into an area, identify homesteads with weak title or families under financial pressure, and they start buying, quietly at first, 1 or 2 parcels. Once they have a foothold, they start applying pressure to the surrounding claims." "What kind of pressure?" "Kind of legal mostly. They file competing claims, challenge the paperwork on existing titles. It costs the homesteader money to fight it, money they usually don't have, and eventually they sell out or walk away." He paused. "In 2 other areas east of the county seat, they've cleared entire sections within 18 months. Clara sat down across from him. "The family's on my route. 3 of them have title issues that Dunmore could challenge. The Pearson claim was filed under her husband's name before they married, which creates a question. The Halverson place has a survey discrepancy. Their eastern boundary is about 40 feet off from the recorded claim. The Brandt family, their original homestead application, has a witness signature that can't be verified because the witness moved on. None of that sounds like fraud, it sounds like paperwork. That's the point. It's not fraud on Dunmore's side. It's paperwork on everyone's side. The kind of small errors that happen when people are filing claims in a hurry on a frontier and the county recorder is handling 200 applications in a year. Dunmore has a lawyer at the county seat who does nothing but find these discrepancies. He looked at her steadily. Clara, they're organized. This isn't someone riding around making trouble. This is a plan. She let that sit for a moment. And they're asking about me, she said. Yes. I talked to a man at the county recorder's office. Not the recorder himself. A clerk who's been there 6 years and has seen Dunmore's lawyer come in more times than he can count. He said the lawyer was asking, specifically, whether the bakery delivery operation was a registered business with a formal supply contract to the homesteads, or an informal arrangement. He paused. The difference matters legally. An informal arrangement can be ended by one party at any time, which means if Dunmore creates enough pressure to make those families sell, your delivery route goes with them. No legal standing to object. But if it were a formal contract, it would establish the homesteads as active, functioning economic units with formal business relationships. Harder to claim they're struggling or abandoned or failing. He waited. A lawyer making that distinction isn't just curious. He's looking for the weakest point in the picture. Clara looked at the table. She thought about Mrs. Pearson's red, chapped hands. She thought about Halverson's children running for the wagon. She thought about 14 miles of road she'd learned curve by curve and rough patch by rough patch. Who's behind Dunmore? She said. Ryder was quiet for a second. I don't know the full picture. The company is registered at the county seat under a man named Carver Dunmore, but he's not local, and I couldn't find anyone who'd met him. What I did find... He stopped. Say it. The lawyer they use, his name is Philip Greer. He and Preston Aldridge were at the same school back east. They've been corresponding. The clerk saw Greer's mail, didn't read it, but knows he's had several letters from this area in the past year. The name landed the way names do when they confirm a fear you'd been arguing yourself out of. Clara sat with it for a moment. Preston, she said, not as a question. I can't prove it. I don't know if he's a partner or if Greer just happened to mention the area to someone he knows. But the timing... Ryder's jaw moved. The timing is what it is. She thought about the apology in the bakery 4 months ago. The way Preston had stood at her counter and said what he'd said with the quality of a man doing a hard thing because it was right. She'd believed him. She'd believed the apology was real. Maybe the apology was real and this was separate. People were capable of both. She knew that. But maybe it wasn't. It doesn't matter, she said. Ryder looked at her. Whether Preston is behind it or not, she said, the problem is the same. The homesteads have title vulnerabilities. Dunmore has a lawyer who knows how to use them, and the question is what can be done about it. She looked at him. What can be done about it? What could be done about it was not simple and was not fast. And the next 3 weeks were the hardest working stretch of Clara's life, which was saying something given the year that had preceded them. She drove out to each homestead on the Thursday route, and she sat with each family and told them plainly what she'd learned. She did not soften it. She'd decided sometime in the ride out to the Pearson place that these were people who deserved to know the shape of the thing coming at them so they could decide for themselves how to meet it. They were not fragile. They'd come out here and built something on difficult land with difficult circumstances, and they were capable of handling real information. Mrs. Pearson listened to everything and then sat quietly for a moment and said, "What do we do?" "First," Clara said, "I want to formalize the delivery arrangement. Put it in writing. A proper supply agreement, with your signature and mine, for a fixed term. It won't solve the title issue, but it establishes that this homestead has active business operations. It makes it harder to characterize you as a failing claim." "Will that be enough?" "Not by itself. You're also going to need to look at the title question." She'd spent 3 evenings at Mrs. Delaney's table with the county land regulation booklet she'd borrowed from the recorder's office, reading and rereading the sections on spousal claim rights. There's a provision, I'm not a lawyer, so you'd need someone to confirm this, but there's a provision for amending a claim to add a spouse as joint holder. If you file that amendment before Dunmore's lawyer challenges the existing title, you're ahead of the problem. Mrs. Pearson looked at her for a long time. "You read the land regulations?" "I read the land regulations." You didn't have to do that. Mrs. Pearson. Clara held her gaze. You take my bread every week and pay fare and send me home with coffee I don't have time to stay for. Of course I'm going to read the regulations. She had similar conversations with the Halverson family and the Brants and the Winslow family, who had a cousin with some legal knowledge and who said, within 5 minutes of hearing the situation, that he would make inquiries at the county seat. The supply agreements she drew up herself, after another evening with Mrs. Delaney and a letter-writing template. Mrs. Delaney produced from somewhere that had the right general shape. They weren't perfect legal documents, but they were signed and dated, and they established something on paper that hadn't existed before. And paper mattered in these situations in ways that intentions did not. Ryder helped with the surveying discrepancy at the Halverson place. He knew enough about land survey to identify that the error was in the original county record, not in the Halverson claim itself, which meant the amendment required was to the county record, which was a different kind of problem, bureaucratic rather than legal. He rode to the county seat twice in September and worked through the process of getting the record corrected, which involved more forms and more clerks and more patience than either of them had expected, and which was finally resolved on a Thursday when the corrected survey came through. He told her about it that Friday evening at dinner with the quality of a man who has finished a tedious job and is glad to have it behind him. Done? She said. Done. The corrected record is filed. Halverson's eastern boundary is where it always was. She exhaled. How many more of these do we have? The Pearson amendment should be through by end of month. The Brant witness signature is the hardest one. He picked up his fork. I've been thinking about that one. The best approach might be to find the original witness. The man moved on. People who move on go somewhere. I know a man at the freight office who keeps track of where people head when they leave this area. It's worth asking. She looked at him. You've been thinking about this constantly. I have a stake in it, he said. Ryder, the delivery route is my business, not yours. I mean, I have a stake in you, he said quietly. You built something and someone's trying to dismantle it. Of course I'm thinking about it. She looked at him across the table for a moment. The windows were open to the September evening, the air starting to carry the first edge of fall, and the bakery smelled like the apple cake she'd put up that afternoon. I've been thinking, she said, about the information you gave me, back in June. He set down his fork. I've been thinking about it since then, she said. You told me not to take it as pressure, and I haven't, but I've been thinking about it, about what it would mean and what I want and whether I'm ready. She folded her hands on the table. I think I am. Ready. I'm not certain. I don't think you're ever certain about big things. But I think the not certain part is just what choosing feels like, not a sign that the choice is wrong. Ryder was very still. You said you'd marry me if I wanted, she said. I want. He looked at her for a long moment, in that direct way he had, the way that never had anything hiding behind it. You're sure, he said. I just told you I'm not sure. I said I think I'm ready anyway. I can work with that. The almost smile, which she had learned to read as the real thing. Yes, he said. Obviously, yes. She reached across the table and he took her hand, and they sat there for a moment without saying anything more, because sometimes the right response to a thing is just to sit in it and let it be true. The trouble she'd been expecting arrived in October, almost exactly 1 year after the wedding that hadn't been, which she noted privately as a piece of timing that was either coincidence or someone's idea of a statement. It came in the form of Philip Greer, the Dunmore Land Company lawyer, who appeared in Dust Hollow on a Monday morning with documents in a manner that had been cultivated specifically to convey that the matter was already decided, and the person receiving the papers was simply being informed of a conclusion. Clara was behind the counter when he came in. He was a slight man with good city clothes and the kind of face that was always slightly at rest, always slightly removed from the situation at hand. He introduced himself, placed papers on her counter, and explained that Dunmore Land Company was filing a business interference claim against her delivery operation on grounds that her informal arrangement with homesteads in the Eastern Territory was operating without proper commercial registration and had been used to establish false evidence of economic viability in property disputes. She looked at the papers. She didn't pick them up immediately. She read the visible portions where they lay on the counter and kept her face neutral. These would need to go to a lawyer, she said. Of course, he said. I'd also note that the company is prepared to offer compensation for the cessation of the delivery operation if Miss Whitmore prefers a simple resolution. How much compensation? She said. He named a figure that was not large, which told her something about how much they thought she needed the money and how desperate they assumed she was. I'll be in touch, she said. He left the papers and went. She picked them up and read them properly, all of it, twice, and then she locked the bakery and went to find Ryder. The next 2 weeks were not clean. Nothing about this process was clean. A legal claim was not something you resolved with a conversation or a supply agreement or a corrected survey. It moved through channels that didn't care about the human situation and at a pace that felt designed to exhaust you. They found a lawyer, not at Dust Hollow, which had no practicing attorney, but at the county seat, a woman named Harriet Vane, who came recommended through Mrs. Delaney's network of people who knew things. Harriet Vane was 50 years old and had been practicing for 20, and had a manner that was simultaneously brusque and precise, and which Clara found immediately trustworthy, because trustworthy people rarely spent energy seeming trustworthy. She listened to the full situation in one sitting and asked 3 sets of questions and then said, "The interference claim is weak. They filed it to create pressure, not because they expect to win it. The question is what they want you to do while it's pending." "Drop the delivery operation," Clara said. "Or settle for their number," Harriet said. "Either way, the homesteads lose the supply connection and lose the economic activity documentation." She looked at her notes. "The supply agreements you drafted, show me those." She looked at them carefully. "These are not perfect," she said, "but they're real and they're signed and they're dated before the claim was filed. That matters." She set them down. "The business registration question is the piece they're actually standing on. Are you registered as a commercial delivery service?" "No," Clara said. "I was delivering bread. I didn't think—" "No reason you would have," Harriet said without judgment. "The question now is whether you can register retroactively and establish the operation as legitimate going forward, which you can. The registration process is not complicated." She looked at Clara directly. "Do it this week, today if possible. I'll handle the response to their claim, but I want you properly registered before I file anything." Clara registered Whitmore Provisions. The name came to her in the county clerk's office, filling out the form, and felt right. On a Tuesday in October, 2 weeks before the hearing date the court had set for Greer's claim. She wrote the name on the form in her own hand and signed it, and paid the filing fee and walked out of the county clerk's office with the receipt in her hand and stood on the street in the October sun for a moment. Whitmore Provisions. 14 miles of road. 7 households. Supply agreements on file. She folded the receipt and put it in her pocket and went to find Ryder, who was waiting outside the freight office. "Done?" he said. "Done." He looked at her face. "How does it feel?" "Like I should have done it 6 months ago," she said. "And like it was exactly the right moment to do it." The hearing was in the county courthouse, a single room with good windows and the particular smell of old paper and wood oil that courtrooms have everywhere. Clara sat at the respondent's table with Harriet Vane on her left and Ryder in the gallery behind her, and she watched Philip Greer present his client's claim with the smooth efficiency of a man who had done this many times in many rooms. It was not in the end a dramatic proceeding. Harriet Vane did not make speeches. She presented the supply agreements, the business registration, the survey corrections, the Halverson title amendment, and a letter from Winslow's cousin, who had turned out to be a man with actual legal credentials, outlining the technical weaknesses in Dunmore's interference theory. She presented these things one by one in a tone that implied she could do this all day and had a great deal more if the court was interested. The judge was a woman named Calloway, who had apparently seen Philip Greer in her courtroom before, which Clara deduced from the quality of attention she brought to his presentation. Careful, patient, skeptical, in a way she didn't bother to conceal. Judge Calloway asked Greer 3 questions, all of which he answered with lawyer's language that said more or less nothing of substance, and she watched him do it with an expression that Clara found herself privately grateful for. The claim was dismissed. Not resolved in Clara's favor in some triumphant legal sense, dismissed, which meant the court found insufficient grounds to proceed. It was a quieter outcome than she might have imagined, sitting with Ryder in the bakery 2 weeks ago looking at those papers. It didn't feel like a victory exactly. It felt like a door closing on something that had been open and cold for too long. Outside the courthouse, Harriet Vane shook her hand and said, "Dunmore will likely try something else. These companies don't stop after one dismissal, but you've established the legitimacy of the operation and you've got proper documentation now. That makes every subsequent move harder for them. What do we do in the meantime? Keep running the business. Keep the agreements current. If their lawyer shows up at any of the homesteads again, the families should note the date and time and contact me. She looked at Clara with something that wasn't quite admiration, but was adjacent to it. You did the groundwork well, for someone without a law background. Those supply agreements, the registration, getting the survey corrected, you didn't wait for someone to tell you what to do. I couldn't afford to wait, Clara said. No, Harriet said. Usually you can't. She walked back to her office, and Clara stood on the courthouse steps with Ryder beside her and looked out at the county seat street, which was larger and louder than Dust Hollow, but had the same basic quality of a place that went on regardless of what happened in the rooms inside its buildings. It's not over, she said. No, he agreed. But today is over. She looked at him. He was standing beside her with his hat in his hands and the fall light on his face, and she thought about the fence line in October, a year ago, the wire posts and his boot on the bottom rail and his voice carrying across the distance without effort, and the spring she'd found with the cottonwood trees and the coffee that wasn't hot and wasn't cold. Come on, she said. We have a long ride back. They were married in November on a Saturday at the boarding house because Mrs. Delaney had offered it, and the church felt wrong for reasons Clara didn't need to fully articulate. The ceremony was short and attended by the people who had been there during the year that had passed. Mrs. Delaney, the Halverson family who drove in for it, Will Sutter and his wife, a few others. Mrs. Pearson sent a letter saying she couldn't make the drive with the baby, but that her good wishes were genuine, which Clara believed. Harlan was there. He stood in Mrs. Delaney's sitting room with his good shirt on and his hair slicked back the way he did for occasions, and he looked at Clara and Ryder, and something moved through his face that she couldn't fully read. Not happiness, not exactly, but something close to relief, which was perhaps the closest her father got to happiness in these situations, and she accepted it for what it was. He shook Ryder's hand afterward and said, "You'll do right by her." Ryder looked at him. "I'll try," he said. "She'll do right by herself, mostly. I'll be there while she does." Harlan looked at him for a moment and then nodded, and Clara thought, there it is, finally, a version of her father that might eventually be the one she'd been waiting for. Possibly. She didn't count on it, but she saw it. The Winslow cousin, who had come down for business at the county seat and was staying a night at Mrs. Delaney's, had brought a bottle of good rye whiskey, and Mrs. Delaney made coffee and apple cake, Clara's recipe, executed by Mrs. Delaney's own hand, which was both a gift and a small act of courage given how good the original was. The cake was not as good as Clara's. It was very good. Clara ate 2 pieces and didn't say a word about the texture. The Dunmore Land Company made one more approach, in January, through Philip Greer again, this time targeting the Brandt claim directly with a title challenge. Harriet Vane's office received the filing on a Wednesday and sent word to Clara on Thursday. Clara read the letter on Thursday afternoon and felt the familiar cold recognition of it. And then, underneath the recognition, something new. Not calm, not exactly, but a kind of steadiness that wasn't about the absence of fear, but about knowing that fear was manageable. She wrote back to Harriet the same day. Ryder rode out to the Brandt place Friday morning and told them directly what was happening. They hadn't found the original witness yet, but Ryder's contact at the freight office had located him 3 weeks ago, a man now living in a settlement 2 counties west who, when Ryder had written to him explaining the situation, had written back saying he remembered signing the document and would swear to it before any court that asked. The affidavit arrived by mail in February. Harriet filed it in response to Greer's challenge. The challenge was withdrawn in March. Philip Greer did not come back to Dust Hollow after that. Clara heard, through the network of information that ran through Mrs. Delaney and the freight office and the county clerk's office and the 7 households on her delivery route, that Dunmore Land Company had shifted its attention to a different area further north. She didn't know if that was because of their failed efforts here or for other reasons entirely. She thought about it once and then decided she didn't have the energy to think about Dunmore Land Company when they weren't actively at her door, and there were other things to spend that energy on. Yeah. The bakery expanded in the spring. Not dramatically. She wasn't a dramatic person about these things, and she'd learned hard lessons about the difference between growth and overreach. She hired a girl named Mabel, 16 years old, daughter of one of the outlying farming families, who came in 3 mornings a week to help with the early baking, and who had, Clara discovered within the first week, good instincts about dough that could be taught into something real. Teaching Mabel was different from how she'd expected. She'd expected it to be like following instructions. Tell the girl what to do, have the girl do it. What it actually was more like what her own mother had done with her. Stand beside her, show her, let her try and fail and try again. Understand that the knowledge transferred through hands more than through words. Mabel burned 2 batches in her first month. The first time she was mortified. Clara told her about the sweet roll incident and the 12 doors and the woman who'd liked the salt. And Mabel laughed with the kind of laugh that releases something. And the next day she came back and tried again. The delivery route ran 15 miles by April, 8 households. Clara had a proper schedule now, printed on a card she gave each family at the start of every month, listing what she'd bring and when, which Harriet Vane had suggested as a practice that reinforced the formal business relationship, and which Clara had adopted and which the families seemed to appreciate as much for the reliability it represented as for the practical information. Ryder still came to town on Thursdays, though the shape of Thursdays had changed since November. He didn't come in to buy bread from behind a counter. He came to the bakery the way you come home somewhere, which required a small internal adjustment every time it happened. Not a negative adjustment, but the kind where your mind has to catch up to a reality that your heart has been living in for a while already. She thought about the year that had passed. Sometimes, in the particular idle moments that baking creates. The early mornings when the ovens were up and the first loaves were in and there was nothing to do but wait. She thought about the parlor with the lace curtains. She thought about turning to the side in her best dress. She thought about the months after, what she'd done to herself and why, and the face in the bakery window that she hadn't recognized. She'd come a long way from that face, not because she'd resolved everything that had made it happen. She wasn't sure those things were fully resolvable, not in the way a math problem resolves, not with a clean answer that makes the question disappear. What had changed was something more like the relationship between herself and the question. She could look at it directly now without the looking destroying her. She could understand what had happened. The way a girl raised on the particular silence of her father's approval had learned to treat that approval as oxygen, had forgotten that oxygen could be manufactured internally, had outsourced the entire operation of her own sufficiency to people who had their own reasons for controlling the supply. She could see it clearly now. Seeing it clearly didn't erase it. But clarity was its own kind of power, and she had more of it than she'd ever had before. The thing she came back to again and again in those early morning waiting moments was something that didn't have a simple articulation, but that she understood in the way you understand things that don't come from books. That the cruelty she'd experienced, Preston's cruelty, her father's cruelty, the town's particular brand of it, hadn't been about her at all. That was the hard truth underneath all of it. The things people said about her body, about her worth, about her prospects and her character and what she was or wasn't, none of it had been information about her. It had been information about them, about their fear and their need to arrange the world in ways that made sense to them and their habit of using available women as the material for that arrangement. She had not been the problem. She had been the surface they'd chosen to project their problems onto, which was different, and the difference was everything. Understanding that hadn't been quick. It hadn't arrived in a single moment of clarity in a cottonwood grove or a bakery or a courthouse. It had come in pieces, over the course of a year that had given her ample raw material to work with, and it was still not completely settled, still not entirely done. She suspected it never would be, not in the way she'd once imagined healing worked. Complete, closed, finished. What was done was living in it anyway, moving forward in it, building things inside it. On a morning in May, almost exactly a year and a half after the day she'd walked out of a church in a ruined wedding dress and into open country, Clara drove the delivery wagon east out of Dust Hollow, with Mabel in the seat beside her learning the route. It was early. The light was the particular light of May mornings, clear and generous and tilted, the shadows still long, the sky a blue that seemed to start from the ground and work upward. The road east was dry, and the wagon was loaded, and Carson's son, who she still thought of as Colt despite Ryder's continuing ambivalence about the name, moved steadily between the traces. "How many stops?" Mabel asked. "8." Clara kept her eyes on the road, noting the familiar landmarks. The bent cedar that meant she was 3 miles out. The stone outcrop that meant the Pearson turnoff was coming. Pearson first, then Halverson, then Winslow. "Which families have children?" "All of them." She glanced at Mabel. "Why?" "I thought if we have extra rolls, I'd know." Clara looked back at the road. "There are always extra rolls," she said. "That's something I plan for." Mabel nodded, filing this. They drove in comfortable quiet for a while. The scrubland opened on either side of the road, and then the road rose, and for a moment, coming over the small ridge that preceded the Pearson turnoff, you could see east, really see east, the ridgeline without obstruction, the kind of view that made you understand the scale of the country you were operating in. Mabel said, "Oh," just that. "Yes," Clara said, "you can see so far." "You can," Clara said. "The town faces the wrong direction. Nobody looks east." She kept driving. "Remember that road condition I mentioned, the rough patch about 2 miles past the Halverson place?" "I'll look for it," Mabel said. But she was still looking east. Clara let her look. She knew the feeling. The morning was doing what May mornings do, which was to be extraordinary without making a particular point of it, just going ahead and being beautiful in the uncomplicated way of the physical world, which does not require an audience or an occasion. The bread in the wagon was good. She knew it was good. She'd pulled a heel end at 4 in the morning and tasted it and knew. Colt moved steadily east. The ridge fell behind them and the road opened out into the long approach to the first homestead, and Mabel was watching the country with the wide attention of someone encountering something for the first time and understanding immediately that it matters. Clara drove and thought about none of the things she sometimes thought about in the early morning quiet. Not the parlor, not the church, not the months of hunger and the face in the window. She thought about the road ahead, which she knew better than she knew most things, which was hers in the sense that you come to own the paths you travel through daily contact rather than through paper. She thought about Ryder, who would be out on the north section of his land this morning, doing something practical that she'd hear about tonight. She thought about Mabel beside her, who was going to burn some bread and learn some things and grow into the work the way people grow into work that fits them. She thought about Mrs. Pearson's coffee and the Halverson children who would hear the wagon and start running, and the particular satisfaction of delivering something to someone who needed it and had been waiting for it and would use it. She thought, this is enough. Not in a resigned way, not in the way of someone setting down an aspiration and accepting less. In the way of someone who has learned to distinguish between enough and insufficient, which is a harder distinction than it sounds, and who has arrived, through a year of considerable difficulty, at a life that is actually hers, not a perfect life. She didn't believe in perfect lives, had never believed in them, was more convinced than ever that the pursuit of perfect lives was one of the mechanisms by which ordinary people were kept from building real ones. Her life had Harlan Whitmore in it, with all of his limitations. It had the memory of what she'd done to herself, which surfaced sometimes when she didn't expect it. It had the ongoing reality of Dunmore Land Company, somewhere north, doing to other families what they'd tried to do here. It had the town of Dust Hollow, which contained people who had been kind, and people who had been cruel, and people who were still deciding. But it also had the road east and the bread in the wagon, and the horizon with the full ridgeline visible without obstruction. It had Mrs. Delaney and Harriet Vane, and the Winslow cousin with his rye whiskey. It had Mabel learning to read dough by feel. It had Ryder Cole, who had said, "What do you need on the worst afternoon of her life?" and meant it, and had been waiting on an answer ever since, and had never once made the waiting into a weapon. She thought she had walked into open country in a wedding dress, and the country had been difficult and vast and impersonal, and had not cared about her at all, and she had navigated it anyway, and she had built things inside it, and she was still here. The wagon moved east. The morning opened around her, generous and unconcerned the way mornings are. And Clara Whitmore, Clara Cole now, though she was still getting used to it, drove toward it with her hands easy on the reins and her eyes on the road and the long country ahead of her full of things she hadn't seen yet and was not afraid to find.